All right, good morning. Thank you everyone for coming. We're gonna get started here. Friday, 9 a.m. Thank you for coming. Totally appreciate it, especially on one of the hottest days in Sacramento, which is lovely. But we're here today to talk about carbon neutrality, and in a really interesting context, I think some really important issues. When we're thinking about the California context for carbon neutrality, it's not just about the technologies or the emission reductions. We need to think about the economic impacts of what we're proposing to do to get deep decarbonization, both within the California borders and globally. So we're going to talk about two topics today, the social cost of carbon and also affordability. We're going to start off with a presentation on the social cost of carbon, which really is a metric to quantify the benefits, or looking at the value side of taking climate action, or the damages that can be caused if we fail to take action when it comes to climate and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. After a presentation by Dr. David Antoff from UC Berkeley, we're then going to transition to talk about affordability and thinking about the impacts on both California and beyond in terms of the costs of our ambition and how we might think about trade-offs in that space as we're looking towards different pathways towards carbon neutrality. So we're going to kick it off with the presentation. Turn it over to you.
Okay, welcome. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So the talk that I'm going to give is, let me just have one watch here, is going to be an overview over the social cost of carbon. It's like a short primer. I've been working on the social cost of carbon for way too long, something like 15 years or so. And so I'll tell you a little bit what it is, how it is used, both in academics and in policy research. And then I'll talk a bit about current research efforts to improve our estimates of the social cost of carbon. And then I'll touch on a couple of important issues that I think, you know, if a policymaker wants to use the social cost of carbon, that you need to be aware of or might think about. So what is the social cost of carbon? It's an economic measure of the harm caused by emitting 1 extra ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. So if you think about us putting a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, an extra ton, that CO2 will stay in the atmosphere for a long time because the physics of the carbon cycle are such that the effects of that extra ton will be felt for many, many centuries into the future. Then that will translate into a slightly higher temperature for many, many centuries than if we had not emitted that 1 extra ton of CO2. And that will cause an incremental extra harm to people around the world. The social cost of carbon is a measure of the total harm done by that 1 extra ton of CO2 that you put into the atmosphere. So why are we interested in that? It's essentially the unit price or unit value of putting either 1 extra ton of CO2 into the atmosphere or reducing emissions by 1 ton. So if you have a policy that reduces emissions by 10 tons, you can multiply the 10 tons times the social cost of carbon to get a measure of the total economic benefit of your policy. So that's how it is typically used in cost-benefit analysis. So how do we compute the social cost of carbon? We use numerical models to do that. All of the figures that I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides are fake. They're illustrative, not real numbers. And so we start out with a model that has some baseline emissions path of CO2. And then we run this model a second time, which we call the marginal run. And we emit 1 extra ton of CO2 in the first time period, the time period for which we want to compute the social cost of carbon. So you can see that here in the little bump in 2015 in my graph. So we now have 2 runs of a model, and the first one is the base run, and the second one is the marginal run. The marginal run has this extra emission in the first time period, or in a specific year. And then the numerical models, which we also call integrated assessment models, trace through what that means for downstream variables. So we then compute CO2 concentrations for these 2 runs, and the CO2 concentrations in the second run will be a little bit higher than in the first run because of that extra ton of CO2 emission that we put out in the first period. We trace it through to temperature, what that means. And then the final step in these integrated assessment models is that we try to quantify the economic harm that is done by that incremental increase in temperature. And what we're thinking about here are impacts to agricultural productivity, health impacts, sea level rise that might flood certain areas. We try to be as comprehensive as we can to quantify the things that humans care about that might be impacted by climate change. And we typically do that separately for different regions of the world. So we can quantify what the impact is for the US versus Europe and other parts of the world. So what we get out of these numerical models is essentially a matrix of the marginal damage that is caused by 1 extra ton of CO2 emission into the atmosphere that tells us what the economic harm or the welfare harm in different regions of the world at different time periods is if we emit 1 ton in the present. So that gives us this matrix, and that's sort of the first important part in computing the social cost of carbon. And then we want to aggregate that into one single number. So we want to, I mean, this is interesting in itself, but for policy analysis, we ideally want one number. And so we take some sort of sum of that, of these individual cells. So the MD here stands for marginal damages. That corresponds to these cells in the table that I'm showing here. And so we just add everything up. But before we add everything up, we apply weights to these marginal damages. And the most typical type of weight that we would apply here are discount factors, so that we discount harms that occur in the future. But there's actually an interesting literature about these weights as well. So I think if you look at the academic literature on the social cost of carbon over the last 15 or 20 years, you will find a lot of literature on what are the marginal damages. So that's the MD part in this equation. And you will find a lot of literature on how should we weight these impacts before we aggregate everything together. Of course, everything here is actually really uncertain. We don't have good point estimates for any of this. So we actually typically do this in terms of uncertain projections, and then we take an expected social cost of carbon. So that's roughly what the social cost of carbon is and how we compute it. The major tool to compute the social cost of carbon over the last 20 years have been integrated assessment models, and that just refers to numerical models that combine components or modules from different academic disciplines. So here's a typical schematic of an integrated assessment model, just to give you a sense of what parts it has, right? So there's parts of the core economy, population modules, there's atmospheric chemistry in there, there's climate dynamics in there, and then there are lots of components in there that try to quantify the economic harm caused by climate damages. Then these integrated assessment models typically close the loop and account for feedbacks between these different parts. So what are the sources of the published social cost of carbon estimates? There are really 3 main models out there that have been used to estimate the social cost of carbon. The Dyson-Rice model by Bill Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize last year for his work on that. The Page model by Chris Hope, which was the model that was used by the Stern Review. And then the Fund model that is developed by Richard Toll and me. I want to highlight one thing. It's a really small group of people working on these core models, which is not great. I mean, it was great for me, but it's not a good situation from a policy point of view. And then there are lots of other papers, for example, meta-studies of social cost of carbon estimates. There are lots of parametric variations of the 3 core models. And sometimes people take, especially DICE, modify it a little bit and produce a new social cost of carbon estimate. But I think you can trace almost every single social cost of carbon estimate that is out there, with a few exceptions, back to one of these 3 sort of parent models in the existing literature. Okay, so let me transition a little bit into how it is used, the social cost of carbon. I'll start with academic use because that's I'm an academic first and foremost. So generally, estimates of the social cost of carbon have been published since the mid-1990s. So this has been going on for quite a while. One Nobel Prize has been won for this kind of work by Bill. And then there's a really robust and large literature on all sorts of aspects around the social cost of carbon. So some papers just produce new estimates and say, okay, we updated certain parts of the models and our new estimate of the social cost of carbon is X. There are a lot of papers that investigate different discounting, equity, and risk preferences and how changes in those model formulations affect the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is used by academics in policy evaluation. So there are lots of papers that look at policies that might change emissions, and then they often use the social cost of carbon to quantify the benefits of those policies. And then in the academic literature, integrated assessment models are often used in optimization exercises where you run an integrated assessment model and ask the model, what's the optimal policy that we would want to implement? So you might ask, what's the optimal temperature target, for example, that we should be shooting for? It has also been used quite a bit in real-world policy cases. The first serious application of the social cost of carbon was in the United Kingdom. They used it throughout the 2000s, roughly. They used it for cost-benefit analysis of individual projects and regulations. So the government might propose a new runway for Heathrow or something like that, and then they would use the social cost of carbon to estimate the economic impacts of that. At a later stage, the UK government transitioned to a policy framework where the government came up with high-level policy targets. So something like, we will reduce emissions by X% by 2050. And then they used the social cost of carbon ex post to analyze those kinds of policies. At the end of the 2000s, around 2009, the United Kingdom essentially gave up on the use of the social cost of carbon. So that they had like 8 or 9 years where they used it, and then they abandoned it because they moved to a framework where they had targets that were that they came up with by other ways, and then they only in policy analysis they only started to look for policies that were compatible with these targets, but were no longer using the social cost of carbon in that exercise. The United States started using the social cost of carbon in earnest in 2010. There were sort of instances before that, but in 2010 it really became front and center. And it is mostly used in the United States for regulatory impact analysis. So if the federal government does any regulation that has a major impact on the US economy, which is defined as an impact of $100 million per year or more, then they must do a regulatory impact analysis. And in those, the federal government is today using the social cost of carbon to quantify any emission changes, the benefits or harms of that. The third country that I'm familiar with that uses the social cost of carbon is Germany. So I'm from Germany, that's why I'm familiar with that. They started using a social cost of carbon around 2007. I'm not actually 100% clear when they started. And they've been using it ever since. It doesn't really play a major role so they have an official social cost of carbon estimate, but the German policy framework is such that cost-benefit analysis doesn't play a big role in policy design. So they have a number, but it's not used that much. I think they had fairly recently 2 laws or legislations where they used it in the analysis, but I think it's playing a much smaller role than in the United States. Okay, let me give you a short history of the social cost of carbon in the United States, because that's probably the most relevant here. So the first thing to note is that everything around the social cost of carbon happened within existing regulatory frameworks, and in particular the Clean Air Act. So in 2007, the Supreme Court ruled that CO2 emissions are a pollutant under the Clean Air Act, and that forced EPA at the federal level to figure out whether they endanger public health and safety, and they found it does in 2009. And that, in combination with existing executive orders that force agencies to do regulatory impact analysis of rules, essentially meant that at the federal level, the government had to quantify the economic harm caused by CO2 emissions. So it was not that there was sort of a legislative push to put this into the policy arena. When the Obama administration came into office, they enthusiastically picked this up, and they formed an interagency working group at the federal level that was spearheaded by the White House and EPA, DOE, and I think something like a dozen federal agencies. And they came up with an official social cost of carbon estimate for the United States at the federal level. They used 3 integrated assessment models, the DICE, Page, and Fund model. They standardized various aspects of these models across the 3 models, and then they used 3 different discount rates to present social cost of carbon estimates at different discount rates. In 2013, they updated the numbers, and the only change they made is that they just used newer versions of the integrated assessment models that had come out in the meantime. So they stuck with everything else and just said, okay, new science has come along, let us update the social cost of carbon number that we're using. In 2015, the White House commissioned a National Academies of Science report because they felt, okay, we can go on and update the SCC every couple of years when the modeling teams have updated the integrated assessment models, but maybe that's not the right thing to do. We're not sure. And so they reached out to the National Academies of Sciences and said, can you convene a panel that actually looks at the practice of using the social cost of carbon and come up with recommendations, both in terms of how the science should progress going forward and how we as an agency should use social cost of carbon estimates going forward. So that was started in 2015, and then the report from the National Academies, I think, was literally released the day before the Trump administration came into office. When the report was commissioned, the idea was that the next administration would take those recommendations and implement them. And we'll see in a moment how that played out. But I think since 2010, roughly, the social cost of carbon has been on the books at the federal level and been used in lots and lots of regulations. Now, the next graph I'm going to show is a bit of a downer, at least for the people that work on the social cost of carbon. It's a paper written by a friend of mine, Bob Hahn, that looked at all the regulations that used the social cost of carbon in their regulatory impact analysis, I think up to the year 2015 or something like that. And it looked at the net benefits that the regulatory impact analysis done by the agency projected with the climate benefits included and without the climate benefits included. And as you can see, all of these regulations would have passed the cost-benefit analysis test, even if the climate benefits had not been quantified, if we had not had a social cost of carbon. So you might look at that and say, oh, so maybe it didn't even matter at all, right, that we had a social cost of carbon. But now keep in mind that many of these regulations were not targeted at climate. So these were regulations of random things. I think the first regulation that used the social cost of carbon was either the regulation of small vending machines or small electric motors. And it just happens to also change carbon emissions. And so you quantify that. But the goal of that regulation was obviously not to solve the climate problem. So many of these regulations, you know, the climate part was really sort of a side effect of some other goal. But there is a regulation, of course, where the social cost of carbon made a real difference. It was proposed after Bob had done the graph that I just showed you, and that was the Clean Power Plan rule. And in the Clean Power Plan rule, the benefits quantified by the social cost of carbon from the rule would have outweighed the cost of the regulation by itself. The benefits of the local health benefits of the rule would also have by itself outweighed the cost of the rule. So there was really a two-prong justification for doing this regulation. So the federal social cost of carbon has really spurred uptake of that concept in many, many areas. So it's used in dozens of federal regulations. Many states are thinking or using the social cost of carbon at this point. Other countries have followed the US lead. So for example, the Canada is using the official US social cost of carbon estimate in their own work. It has triggered it hasn't had an intellectual influence. So for example, here, a couple of conservative thinkers have proposed a carbon tax, and the level of the tax that they proposed is directly taken from the social cost of carbon estimates. And then there are various court cases where the social cost of carbon has been used. Okay, I should probably speed up a little bit. Very briefly on Trump, they're still using the social cost of carbon. They changed two things, how it is computed. And that is they used a different discount rate, and they are only counting the benefits to people within the US borders now. And that allowed them to lower the social cost of carbon estimates from $40 to $1. But the framework is still in place, which is interesting. Okay, let me briefly talk about current research efforts to improve the social cost of carbon. They are both currently happening outside of the federal government process, because there's no indication that the federal government right now is interested in updates or anything like that. There's one that's called the Climate Impact Lab. It's spearheaded by these folks that I'm listing here. And their project is trying to come up with new damage estimates from climate change. So translating temperature increases into economic harms, which is one of the core parts of integrated assessment models. The other one is spearheaded by Resources for the Future, called the Social Cost of Carbon Initiative. I'm part of that one, so I'm more familiar with that. And it really has as a goal to implement all the recommendations that the National Academy report proposed within the next, so that whenever EPA wants to pick up new social cost of carbon estimates that implement these recommendations, then they're ready. The RFF initiative has many, many different parts. We're building a computational platform for integrated assessment models that makes it much easier and more transparent for users to run these models. We're producing new probabilistic forecasts of socioeconomic scenarios, which is really important for computing the social cost of carbon. We're replacing the existing natural sciences in these models with state-of-the-art natural science components in collaboration with leading climate scientists. And then we're trying to integrate existing new damage estimates from the literature into these integrated assessment models. And we're working on the discounting module to make that compatible with the recommendations from the National Academy's report. I'm going to skip all of this because I'm running out of time. I want to talk about a few important issues in policy use when you use the social cost of carbon. So the first one I want to talk about is equity, because I thought the second half of this panel will be about equity, and so that might be a nice segue. The equity question, though, that we grapple with in the social cost of carbon is probably at a different scale than the equity level I think that a lot of California climate policy grapples with. There are really three ways, and this is a huge simplification what I'm going to do now, but there are really three broad approaches to deal with equity in the social cost of carbon approach. The first one is that you count worldwide damages, what we call a global social cost of carbon. So what you do is we emit 1 extra ton of CO2 here, it will cause harm everywhere. It will cause harm within the United States, but it will also cause harm in Germany and in Bangladesh and around the globe. And in the social cost of carbon that we estimate, we count all of these harms into the number. So when we do now a cost-benefit analysis with such a social cost of carbon, we are including the benefits to non-US people, because we're so if the Clean Power Plan rule had a climate benefits of X dollars, then that included benefits that accrue to people outside of the US borders. So that was the story that the Obama administration had used. A different approach here in terms of equity is to not count benefits to anything outside of the United States. So you only count the benefits that accrue to people within the United States borders. So we put up a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. It causes harm in the United States. We count that. It also causes harm outside of the United States borders, but we do not count that in our social cost of carbon estimate. And that's one of the major changes that the Trump administration implemented. So they went from a global social cost of carbon to what's called a domestic social cost of carbon. Now, if we go back to the global social cost of carbon for a moment, though, there's one peculiar thing. So if there is $1 harm to me, and there is $1 harm to someone who lives on $1 a day, then in this logic, that has the same weight. So whether I have $1 harm or someone in sub-Saharan Africa has $1 harm, that's $1 harm. But you could argue that $1 loss to someone who is really, really poor, who lives on $1 a day, is way worse in terms of welfare than if I lose $1, right? I mean, I won't even notice it. And so in the academic literature, there's another approach which is called the equity-weighted social cost of carbon that tries to adjust for that discrepancy. And it gives more weight to harms that accrue to people that are low income. Okay, so it essentially, before we add everything together, in that logic, you look at the person that is harmed, and if that person is lower income, it gets that harm is elevated relative to a harm to someone who's rich. And that is an equity-weighted social cost of carbon approach, and that was used by the United Kingdom when it was still using social cost of carbon estimates. Unfortunately, they made a really embarrassing math mistake, so actually what they used was just garbage, but that's in spirit, they tried to use this. and Germany is using this approach as well. So all three of these approaches are, have been or are currently being used, and they're really very, very different approaches on how you think about equity. Okay, I'll talk about this one and then I'll stop, I think. There's one. So we can give you a number, the people that work on this social cost of carbon estimate, and I can give you a number, and then you go to the next modeling group and they will give you a number, and those numbers will be quite different. So the estimates of the social cost of carbon are really, really uncertain, and they have deep structural uncertainty that in many ways, we don't really know which of these models is correct, and we have a range of models. So my first just caveat here, if you come across someone and that person tells you, oh, I know what the social cost of carbon is. It is X, and all the other models are wrong, and mine, get very suspicious, okay? That's, I think, not where we are in terms of research at this point. So I think going forward in the short term and medium term, we will, as a policymaker, you just have to be aware that there are different models out there, and they give quite different estimates, and the uncertainties around this number are quite large. And so I think it's really important for policymakers to be transparent about these uncertainties. I think the history of the social cost of carbon use is a good guide what are good strategies there and which are not. So I think the US federal strategy to use 3 different models and be quite transparent about the differences in these 3 models was a good strategy, because it essentially meant that the different opinions in this debate had a place in the official estimation procedure. There have been other exercises, for example, in the United Kingdom, where they picked one model, and immediately what happens after that is that all the other people say, oh, you picked this one model because you wanted that one number, and you ignored 2/3 of the other literature. So just be aware of that if you want to do social cost of carbon estimates. I think you have to sort of tackle this problem heads on and think hard how you're going to deal with the situation that the research does not give you one narrowly estimated number at this point. And I'm going to skip this. And I had a grumpy evening yesterday, so I'm going to do this really quickly. I think the social cost of carbon is really important. It has really literally moved, I think, billions of dollars in the US economy. It's used by many, many agencies. And as far as I know, not a single of the policy users of the social cost of carbon has ever provided any funding for social cost of carbon work, which is bizarre, right? So if you think about how important that one number is and how much funding flows to the natural sciences of climate research, and then you have like 4 guys working on these models, which is, I mean, it's changing now because of these big initiatives and their private foundations stepping into the void. But I think at some point, if agencies want to use social cost of carbon estimates for real, and we recognize that there are many uncertainties and research needs, then we, I think, need sort of a serious effort to fund this kind of research. All right, that was my grumpy slide. All right. So I think my conclusion is that the social cost of carbon at this point is really deeply embedded in the policy fabric of the United States. It's at various different levels, from federal, state, court cases, and so on, and international. And I think while there are a lot of efforts to improve the social cost of carbon estimates, we also should just recognize that it's uncertain, and we're in. If we think where we would want to be in terms of certainty and research, then we're really at the beginning of the road in some sense. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very informative, and you were very nice about the new federal revisions on the social cost of carbon. I think for a little bit of California context, we do have a legislative mandate in California, AB 197, to consider social costs whenever we propose measures that go beyond our 2020 greenhouse gas emissions limit. So in our 2017 scoping plan, we did have a section where we did quantify the benefits using the social cost of carbon under the Obama administration interagency working group values. And we came out very strongly and said that California will use those values until there is a time at which the science and the research has been approved. I should also note that under the umbrella of the U.S. Climate Alliance, California is in a partnership with RFF, the Climate Impact Lab, also Mexico and Canada, to commit to using the social cost of carbon across states and to be consistent about that, and to commit to being part I don't know about the funding, but of the research and hopefully following the science and applying the social cost of carbon across different states in the absence of federal leadership here. So I did want to open it up to see if there were any questions for David. Hold on, we have a microphone, will come.
Was it? I didn't see. It's on.
McKinley added with that. Thank you for your excellent presentations, very informative about the background of SCC. You talked about the uncertainties surrounding SCC estimates. Would you be able to or care to characterize what the uncertainty level might be?
Okay, so, all right, I think I have a slide for that. Thanks for the question. So this gives you a little bit of a sense here. This is from the official EPA estimates. It shows you the social cost of carbon from 3 different models for different discount rates. So if you only focus on the column with the 3% discount rate, which was the central discount rate that the EPA used for their official number, you can see that the lowest number there is fund with $17, and it goes to page to $58. So that's the discrepancy that we see here between different integrated assessment models in the social cost of carbon estimate. If you look at the different columns, you can see what the choice of discount rate means for the social cost of carbon. So if you use a 5% discount rate, then, for example, for DICE, you get an $11 per ton of CO2. If you use a 2.5% discount rate, you get $48 of CO2. So I think that table gives you already a sense that we're not trying to get the first digit right after the decimal point, right? We're in a different, the uncertainty here spans a different orders of magnitude. And I think this here shows point estimates. I think I have do I have that? Just see. So this shows a histogram of the social cost of carbon for different discount rates averaged over the 3 models. So this is sort of the parametric uncertainty. And you can again see that, so A, it's heavier in the right tail, in the bad tail, and it's uncertain, right? So there's really weight in there in the tails. But that's where it is. I mean, if you think about the problem that we're trying to tackle here, we're trying to quantify the harm that's being caused by something we do today, centuries into the future. If we were to come out here and say, I can tell you exactly what that is, you should laugh us off the stage, right? That would be ridiculous. So I think the challenge here for policymakers really is to acknowledge the uncertainties that are here and then come up with a plan how you deal with that in your policy decision making.
Thank you. So a quick follow-up there. I don't know if you're familiar with the U.S. Court of Appeals case that found the use of $42 as an SCC was sort of valid. There was no discussion about the uncertainty surrounding that number, and I don't know if you might care to comment on the $42 SCC.
So I'm not familiar with that court case. I'm not a lawyer. I don't, thank God. I think I think overall, the number that the Obama administration came up with was a very reasonable story. You can quibble with things here and there, but I think overall, that was a credible, in line with the central tendency of the literature, well done exercise. So I think that is really good. I didn't say much about the revisions about the Trump administration. Maybe let me say my personal opinion about those revisions, where you go from the $40 to about $1. I think that especially the change in the discount rate that the Trump administration proposed, going from a 3% discount rate as the central case to a 7% discount rate as the central case, you cannot square that with anything written in the academic literature. A 7% discount rate, a constant discount rate for such long time horizons is just ridiculous, quite frankly. Now, there is a twist to that, and that is that there are OMB guidelines on the books that were written in the early 2000s that say a 7% discount rate should be used at the federal level for certain things. So it's not that there is no basis for a 7% discount rate sort of in the regulatory environment, but from a substantive matter, whether 7% is appropriate in this case, I think the literature, I mean, you know, there are many uncertainties in the climate econ literature, but the 7%, I can promise you, there's unanimous agreement. You will not find any serious scholar who thinks that is reasonable. I think the guidelines there are just incorrect for something like the climate story.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Professor. My name is Ignacio Fernandez. I'm with Southern California Edison. Currently, we are providing comments to the Committee on Environmental Quality on the NEPA greenhouse guidance. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Well,
no, I'm not, I'm afraid.
So the committee, the Council on Environmental Quality at the federal level is issuing a new set of guidelines, replacing the ones that were issued on the Obama administration, and it goes into stripes on how to address social cost of carbon, which is, you can assume, a very different view. And I wanted to see if you have any opinion on that. But
no, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with what's going on there.
All right, thank you.
Clayton Munnings with the International Emissions Trading Association. Thanks, Professor Antoff. You mentioned a few examples in your presentation about how the social cost of carbon is used in different regions around the world. This may be outside of scope, but I was wondering if you could offer any guidance or principles related to how you think the social cost of carbon should be used in a policy context. How often should it be updated? Should it be used to inform CBA rules? Any other kind of points of best practice or wisdom you can share?
Yeah, so that's a broad question. So a good question. So I think broadly you could think of two ways in which you can use the social cost of carbon. One is sort of what you might call the pure econ approach, where you would use the social cost of carbon to run a gigantic cost-benefit analysis of what we should do overall about climate. So you use something like the social cost of carbon or these integrated assessment models to come up with the optimal temperature target that we should be shooting for. So should we be shooting for 2 degrees or 3 or 4 or 1.5? And you use these economic models to inform that kind of decision. So I think that's one way. And there's a fair bit in the academic literature published along those lines. To my knowledge, that approach has never been used in the policy space. And I have to admit, I get quite nervous about the thought of that being the use in the real world policy of these models, because they leave out a lot of things. And we should probably pick these targets not purely based on a cost-benefit analysis out of models that are quite incomplete. So I think it's interesting and informative, these kinds of exercises, but I think as a policy tool, I think that is probably taking these models too far. The other way to do this is to look at individual regulations, individual laws, sort of not the big picture story, but you know, small incremental policies, and try to use the social cost of carbon to quantify what the economic benefits or harms of those individual projects are. And so you're using it individually for marginal projects. And I think that is a very valid approach. I think that's great. I'm thrilled that more and more jurisdictions are moving into that space. I think that is really helpful. I do think that this question of how you treat damages outside of the borders of your own jurisdiction is a really tricky one. And it obviously has major implications for the size of the social cost of carbon that you end up using. So, and as you can see, you know, different jurisdictions have used very, very different choices there. So I think that is an interesting area of discussion. I personally think that these equity-weighted numbers make a lot of sense, but I can also see arguments why you might want to stay away from that.
Thank you. That was clear. A quick follow-on. You mentioned that in the first half of your response that the models are incomplete. Would you venture a hypothesis? If there were complete models, would the social cost of carbon number be higher, lower? Question mark. Would you venture a guess there?
My guess would be that it is probably that the SCC would probably be higher, but it is very, very difficult. So I've been doing this for a long time, and from time to time we add a new, we find a new study that quantifies something that we previously hadn't quantified. I by no means have ever been able to beforehand tell you how that will play out once we put it in, because these are fairly complicated models, right? So it's not that you can. I think you have to be quite careful with gut feelings in this space.
Thanks.
Okay, very good. Dr. Antoff, it's Frank Harris with California Municipal Utilities Association. Thank you very much for your presentation. I want to kind of expand on one of your statements that you just made regarding equity. Based analysis. Equity is something that's very important to us here in California. And when I watched your presentation, I immediately thought that perhaps instead of increasing this equity-based value, there might be a way of compensating directly, and sort of a potential Pareto type thing. And so I'm curious if you could expand on that in terms of how that could possibly palpably be applied in a policy context.
Yeah, so, all right. So how can I do this without this turning into one of my lectures? Well, one of my long lectures. This equity-weighted social cost of carbon is a tricky beast. Let's put it this way, because if you use that, it is essentially making an assumption that you do not have compensation payments, and if you combine that with an assumption of compensation payments, which would be great because you could go for Pareto improvements. If you were to do that, then even computing the value of these compensation payments all of a sudden gets very, very difficult. Because if you make a compensation payment from you to someone who's poorer, then under this logic of these equity weighting things, that's a welfare improvement. So lump sum transfers in this logic are no longer welfare neutral, which is sort of the standard approach in an efficiency-based story. So I think this equity weighting approach is more complicated. You're entirely right. In some sense, if an agency were to use equity-weighted social cost of carbon numbers and does its projects evaluation, then it could actually do better by compensating some poor regions and using a lower SCC in a very crude way, right? That would be a Pareto improvement. But I think what this comes down to me is that. So this equity weighting literature goes back to the distributional weights and cost benefit analysis literature from the 70s. So there's sort of a really distinguished literature on that. And that in mainstream economics sort of went out a little bit out of fashion, that approach, because the idea that we separate efficiency and equity considerations sort of really took over in economics. But that really only makes sense if you think that you have something a policy tool to address the equity considerations. And maybe you can argue within a country you have things like an income tax schedule that might achieve some distributional objective that you have, maybe. But at the international scene, we really have nothing, right? I mean, this is there is no. How would California compensate? That's just. There's nothing, right? No framework in place. So I think in that sphere, taking equity into consideration explicitly again, I think makes sense to me. And I think so to just give you a sort of a sense of where the literature on that is, I think this equity weighting literature is not the majority of people working in climate economics, but it's not fringe at this point. So there's a really sizable literature on that. Important academics have written on this. and it's been used by certain countries. So I think it's, you know, a not small minority view at this point.
Over here. Thank you, Professor, for that. Unfortunately, I think this topic alone deserves a whole day seminar. My head's still swimming, and I didn't have enough coffee this morning to absorb it all. But please take these comments as constructive. This is coming from a person that came here today to learn about this stuff. I know the terminology, but I don't know the basis for it, and that's what I wanted to get today. So my takeaway from this presentation is all the models, or the genesis of all the models, are 4 or 5 people. None of the models agree. There's a great amount of uncertainty in these models. And then if you close the borders just to the United States, you have a 40-to-1 ratio of social cost. Now, I find that extremely disturbing, and maybe I just don't understand the full context of everything here. But bear in mind, and you said right up front, you're an academic person. If you're a policy person and look at what's going on, maybe it's not as ridiculous as you seem to close the borders, because from a policy standpoint, that's exactly what policymakers are doing. They're closing the borders on policy. Here in California alone, we have other regions of the state, I'm not going to mention names, Bay Area, that you know, they feel they want to regulate greenhouse gases directly. They don't care about what ARB is doing, and ARB may have a more global perspective. But even ARB, for example, in the regime of offsets, they don't want offsets to go outside the boundaries of California, which is just ridiculous on its surface because, you know, as we know, this is a worldwide pollutant. So this is more of a comment than a question. You're welcome to comment on this, but this is such a complicated issue that I think you're right. I think it deserves a lot more research, a lot more effort, but I'm very disturbed by the fact that there's so much uncertainty surrounding this. We are basing so much policy and so much money on these it's a concern, I think.
So, okay, let me, so I should say that to go from the 40 to the 1, you need to change 2 things. You need to only count US damages, and you need to increase the discount rate dramatically. Let me say, so I already told you that I think the discount rate change that they made that is, I think, actually not one of the uncertainties. I think the change they made there is just not justified by the academic literature, right? There are other things where we academics disagree. I think there, the policymakers actually made a change where the academics would agree that it is inappropriate. And I think that can happen in any policy space, right? So I think that one thing, I think yeah. But let me say something about this domestic versus a global social cost of carbon. So the pure econ story, why we are not solving the global climate problem, is that it's a public goods problem. So people try to free ride on it. So it's individually for you rational to not do anything about it and hope that everyone else will fix the problem for you. And if everyone does that, then we're in big trouble because we essentially have not solved this problem. And you can think of this domestic social cost of carbon estimate as picking the strategy of free riding. It's not 100% correct, but it's sort of close enough to say that if a jurisdiction says we're going to use a domestic social cost of carbon, then it is essentially saying we're going to free ride on this problem. We're not interested in achieving a economically efficient outcome where we solve this public goods problem. The tricky thing is that free riding from an individual point of view is rational. So you cannot say that it's, but that's sort of that's the core problem of the climate policy, that we need to collaborate and on this if we want to solve it. If everyone rationally free rides, then we will burn this planet down.
And that, from an academic standpoint, you're correct. However, from a practical standpoint, a lot of the world is free riding. And so I think the U.S. has a right to know what is the cost within our boundaries.
Yeah.
Since we're picking up the bulk of the work on this.
I mean, it's an interesting information, right? I don't think it's wrong to estimate it, but I do think that if a policymaker, I mean, we just need to be clear about this. If a policymaker picks a domestic social cost of carbon, or you could think of, something that is limited in, then that policymaker is essentially free riding, if the policy is based on that, and that means they're not trying to solve this climate problem. As an academic, I think at that point I have to stop, right? And I actually think that is also a point where there's not disagreement in academics. I think that is all very simple and clear. I think the uncertainties really come in the precise estimates of the damages, right? So when I showed you the discrepancy in the numbers between the different models, those are, I think the discounting and this domestic versus global question, those are not really scientific empirical questions. Those are choice questions that policymakers have to make. But the uncertainties really come in measuring these things and trying to estimate them. And I think that's really within the models and between the models.
Okay, we'll take one more question, and then we're going to take a short break.
Hi, Jeff Brown with PG&E. Thanks for the presentation. One other source of kind of distribution of values here is whether you're using the central value or from the tail. I wonder if you could speak to how you view the role of the high impact value, or that $128 per ton in kind of the policy space.
The way EPA did this is that they explicitly presented this 95th percentile, and I think the guidelines was that agencies should also look at that. I think it was a little bit unclear what exactly you should do with that number, but it was sort of presented there so that agencies do not fall into the trap of thinking, oh, it's $40 and there's no uncertainty around it. So I think in terms of just presentation, that was a pretty good approach. Another way you can deal with this is that you can use a formal risk aversion model where you try to estimate a social cost of carbon that has a risk premium included in the social cost of carbon estimate. So at that point, you have collapsed it into one number. You, in some sense, don't need to show the distribution anymore because you already have a risk premium in your expected social cost of carbon. That's not really what EPA. There's some wishy-washy language about that, but I think from an academic point of view, it's fair to say that that's not what EPA did here. It's unclear. When I wear my econ hat, which is my home discipline, then I really like the risk aversion story. But I think there's also value for agencies sometimes to actually look at the disaggregated story and maybe look for policies that are robust under different uncertainties, where you do not do the aggregation into one number with the risk premium, but instead you have your policy and you see, okay, how would the policy fare if the 95th percentile actually occurs? And you do that explicitly instead of relying on this risk aversion term. I think there's actually also value in that approach. So I think actually the way EPA did this to be transparent about this and then encourage people to, when they use the social cost of carbon, to be aware of those problems or those uncertainties is probably a good approach.
Great, thank you. Let's take a quick break and come back at like 10:10, and then we'll start with the next panel. Thank you.
Okay, so you got it. story than someone who's poor, but it does not distinguish whether we are rich because of carbon emissions or because of pick your favorite explanation, right?
Okay.
It just says,
right.
okay, you're rich. We're counting dollars a little less if they accrue to you.
Okay. Do you have a card?
I do.
Would you be willing to maybe come talk to my staff?
Sure.
Because we are working on all this. I'll talk a little bit about how we are looking at trying to use the social cost of carbon because our framework's a little different because it's not just regulation and what's the impact of regulation. It's more command and control. Like you will buy X number of resources and X type of resources, and we want to be able to take the societal cost of carbon into account when we're directing.
No, I'd love to engage.
Okay, good. there was a big fire up near a transmission line that was further up north, and so one of the substantial ones. We're keeping an eye on this. We're keeping an eye on this. And then the fire changed course. Another year. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to get started. If everyone can please take their seats or take it outside. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here a little bit after a great talk about how we think about some of the benefits or how you estimate some of the value in taking action on climate. We're going to switch to think about affordability. So I think this is a nice dovetail to this morning. It's sort of two different sides of the coin. In California, we do consider the economic impacts when we promulgate regulations and when we look towards policies and planning. And so in the context of carbon neutrality, it's really important to consider the economic impacts of what the actions that we're taking or proposing on California, on Californians, and globally, and how do we quantify that? So we're going to have a discussion today focused on affordability in different contexts. We have a great panel. They're each going to give about a little presentation, some opening remarks, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion and hopefully some time for questions. So really excited to have Commissioner Leanne Randolph here. She is going to kick this off. She's with the Public Utilities Commission, and take it away.
Hi. Thank you for having me here. First, I'm going to bridge the conversation a little bit and talk about what we are thinking about in terms of the societal cost test, and then I'll talk a little bit about what the issues we're grappling with related to affordability. So first of all, the Commission has been looking at applying the societal cost test in the context of distributed energy resources and how we can ensure that we are valuing distributed energy resources and new clean energy technology in an appropriate way. And so we originally, in our distributed energy resources proceeding, were thinking about the societal cost test. And then a few months ago, the Commission adopted a decision directing us to study the societal cost test more thoroughly and figuring out how to apply it in our integrated resources long-term planning proceeding. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the IRP, basically it is a proceeding to identify, pursuant to a mandate in SB 350, the optimal mix of resources that will apply, that will move us toward our GHG emissions targets. So it requires us to work in conjunction with CARB and set a target, and then develop a energy portfolio that moves the emissions in the energy sector towards the target that we identified. So in February, we approved a preferred system portfolio that identifies the lowest cost set of resources that meets both GHG and reliability goals. But it hasn't fully integrated the societal cost test analysis into that portfolio. And so what we are going to be doing over the next several months is taking a look at the societal cost test, taking a look at the different ranges that were discussed earlier, and trying to figure out whether and how to apply them to our portfolio so that we can identify resources that take into account the societal impact of emissions. But that has to be done in a framework that ensures reliability and ensures lowest cost. And so one of the things we are thinking about at the PUC is not just sort of the cost of the resources in the abstract, but also how it affects ratepayers and what the affordability impacts are on ratepayers. So recently we started a new proceeding that analyzes the questions of affordability. And so Commissioner Cliff Rexhoffen is the assigned commissioner on that proceeding. And just to give you some numbers, California has close to 1 in 5 persons living in poverty. More than 20% of households in our state spend over half their income on housing, and low-income households spend more than half of their income on housing. So the thinking about the impact of utility bills on individuals who are already having difficulty affording the high cost of living in our state is important. Currently, electricity bills generally track inflation. It may not seem that way sometimes when you see your rate increases, but the reality is, for the most part, they are tracking inflation. There are some exceptions. For instance, San Diego Gas and Electric's rates are now moving up past inflation. And there are some kind of pressures in that area that I'll kind of mention. And also, as we go forward and deal with adapting to climate change, we're going to see more spikes in heat, and we're going to see more challenges related to cold. And so those bumps can cause hardship for individual customers. And the utilities all have programs where you can spread your bill out over 12 months, but a lot of people don't know about the programs, and they don't necessarily take advantage of them. So we need to be aware of those impacts on rates and budgeting and affordability for individual ratepayers. And then lastly, we have to be cognizant of some of the major cost pressures that come from wildfire mitigation. It's a difficult and growing problem in the state, and the utilities recently submitted their wildfire mitigation plans to identify measures that they would take to mitigate wildfire risk. And while we approved the measures, we haven't delved into actually approving the specific costs. So we don't have numbers for the specific costs, but we do have some general estimates based on the plans and some of the measures within the plans, including vegetation management, installing covered conductors, doing additional inspections, creating more weather stations, and visibility of the system throughout our electric utilities. So for all of our investor-owned utilities, which include PG&E, Edison, SDG&E, and then some small ones like Bear Valley Electric, PacifiCorp, and Liberty up in the Tahoe area, in 2019 and 2020, wildfire mitigation expenditures will be in the ballpark of $1.7 billion in capital expenses and $1.03 billion in operations. So those are significant dollars that are going to put significant pressure on rates. And so the affordability proceeding is going to be trying to understand how to analyze the impact on customers. The proceeding is looking at what is the definition of affordability? And the working definition that is being talked about in the proceeding is that utility costs are affordable if the household can regularly pay for essential service of each utility type on a full and timely basis without substantial hardship. And so the proceeding will be looking at things like, if you are working at minimum wage, full-time, what was your capacity to pay utility bills, and how would that capacity to change as utility rates increase? And so we will continue to work on that. I will say that sort of defining affordability and understanding affordability is one thing, figuring out kind of what the next step is, and how to sort of protect people who are having affordability issues is another. There are low-income programs that the utilities have. There are energy efficiency measures that utilities have that help low-income people become more energy efficient. But we think understanding the impacts on individuals as we look at more discretionary decisions about how much more carbon reduction can the electric sector handle, it's going to be important to make sure that we have tools to keep that affordability issue top of mind and understand when we are talking about what the electric ratepayers can bear. We need to be able to understand that and have a framework for understanding it. So that's our goal going forward.
Great, thank you. I do have one quick question, if you don't mind. Could you explain a little bit about the current approach on the societal cost test that PUC employs?
So we do have, in the integrated resources planning proceeding, we have a planning price that we identified so that utilities can use that planning price in their long-term planning in IRP. But it's fairly crude, and it's not really kind of where we want to be in terms of understanding how to include the societal costs as part of the procurement process.
Thank you. Okay, up next is Ross Brown from the Legislative Analyst's Office.
All right, great to be here. Thanks to Emily and Carb for the invitation. Just as a little bit of context on kind of our role, we were kind of nonpartisan fiscal and policy advisors to the state legislature. And in particular, we've been kind of doing some thinking around the issues of climate policies and the costs of implementing those policies, as well as the benefits. We have a statutory requirement in law to annually look at the economic impacts and benefits of the state's climate policies. And so we issued a couple reports last year, kind of taking an initial stab at doing that. So that's kind of the context of kind of where we're coming from and what we've been looking at and what we hope to look at in the future. So I want to touch on a few things. I do want to kind of state up front, respect sort of what a difficult challenge it is trying to kind of define affordability. Even that on its own, I think, is difficult and involves a lot of kind of important questions and value questions, and discussions around the benefits as well as the costs and kind of what you're getting for your money and affordability. So that's a challenge. I think I'm going to focus most of my comments on kind of a little bit higher level on just sort of the overall social costs of policies that California is implementing or thinking about implementing going forward, and in particular thinking through some of the metrics and models that are kind of currently available or often used to evaluate what those costs are and in some ways the distribution of those costs. I'm going to highlight in many cases kind of a lot of the limitations we have seen and kind of see in some of those efforts so far. The intent is not really to be critical. I think we fully recognize how difficult it is to try and fully capture kind of all of the different effects associated with the different policies that California is implementing or thinking about implementing. Our intent, I think, is really just to kind of highlight what in a lot of cases what we don't know, or what in some cases some of those models or metrics might not capture, just so policymakers can kind of have those in mind and potentially going forward and think about ways to better capture those costs. So a lot of discussion before I get to some of the models and metrics. I wanted to talk about a lot of the discussion I think is on kind of households and at the household level and affordability. I do want to just note, a lot of the costs associated with some of the policies are directly borne by businesses, which in some cases can kind of impact a household in the form of higher prices and consumption. But there are other avenues like wages and shareholder returns and other things like that that I think are kind of important to keep in mind in this conversation that affect households as well. It's just a little bit different mechanism. So first, I think it's important, I want to talk about kind of some of the modeling that's often used to particularly project going forward what some of the costs are associated with the state's climate policies. One thing I think we often like to kind of note is there's a bunch of different actions that different actors, businesses, and households can be taking to reduce their emissions, and the types of costs associated with those actions are oftentimes very different. So in some cases, there are kind of more explicit monetary costs, like, for example, just using a different technology or set of technologies to generate electricity that people use. And those are oftentimes not easy to calculate or estimate, but there are ways to do that. And I think a lot of the modeling efforts done so far kind of try to do that, could put kind of a monetary value on some of those costs. I think it's important to keep in mind that there are other types of kind of costs or considerations that policymakers should be thinking about that are more implicit, and there isn't maybe a monetary payment going out, but they're nonetheless sort of important, and there's kind of a welfare associated with those. When you think about things like electrification and kind of moving to different technologies. And, I know there's lots of discussion around kind of electrification of stoves and those types of things. There are, potentially sort of more qualitative aspects to kind of policies that push those different technologies that people value and households value that don't necessarily show up in kind of some of the more techno-economic models that are oftentimes used to kind of project costs of different policies. So I think that's just one kind of important thing to flag. I think another important area for this question is around vehicle miles traveled. So a lot of the models that are used to kind of project the costs and benefits of meeting some of the state's emissions targets, they largely, my sense is, kind of ignore kind of what the costs and benefits of what policies might be needed to push vehicle mile travel reductions going forward, whether that be kind of moving to more transit and what's needed there, how that affects, how long it takes people to get to work, those types of things. Pushing more housing in denser communities, which maybe in a lot of cases doesn't have a cost. Maybe that there's more of kind of a implicit benefit to policies that kind of push those types of activities that reduce carbon emissions, but also have potentially huge benefits to both housing prices, but as well as just sort of the time it takes individuals to get to and from work and the amount of time that they spend in their car. So I think that's just the big picture, I think, issue is just kind of trying to keep in mind all of those different costs and benefits when we're thinking about the state's climate policies and what their effects are. Quick plug for, I think in some cases that also can be kind of an argument for focusing on carbon pricing, since it is oftentimes so difficult to estimate what some of those costs are associated with the policies. And so one of the benefits of carbon pricing is that oftentimes it'll just provide those incentives to different households and businesses, and they can kind of make a judgment on their own about what the most cost-effective approach is. The second issue I want to touch on is more of kind of a metric, I think, that's often used to evaluate the costs and affordability of policies, and that's kind of looking strictly at energy prices and the effects of policies on energy prices. I mean, that clearly matters and has an effect on households and households' budgets. However, I think there are some significant limitations, and I think one thing I'd like to point out is that energy prices and increases in energy prices is not the same as kind of a social cost of reducing a ton of emission. And one example where that kind of shows up is impacts on gasoline prices, and that's oftentimes in the policy arena a metrics that's used to sort of evaluate affordability. And if you look at cap and trade and the LCFS, they have right now maybe a pretty similar impact on gasoline prices, but the mechanisms that they use to encourage emission reductions are very different. And if you look at what the kind of cost per ton and what emission reductions each policy is encouraging, LCFS is closer to $200 per ton, whereas cap and trade is now less than $20 per ton. And so the reason why they have different impacts on gasoline prices is they have just different mechanisms for encouraging emission reductions. And in particular in cap and trade, when you're thinking about the overall effect of that policy and affordability, that there's an important component to that program where there's a transfer of resources to the government, which can then use those resources to address affordability issues, in particular if gasoline prices get higher. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, particularly in the conversation that we're having around kind of deeper decarbonization, and which could lead to much higher allowance prices, which have clear effects on gasoline prices and hit oftentimes lower income households the hardest. And so thinking about how the state uses that revenue to address those affordability challenges through rebates or tax reductions or other things like that will be important going forward. One last thing I want to mention, just because I can't help myself and wanted to touch on, is thinking about going forward in the state's efforts to reduce emissions. We think it's incredibly important for the state to focus some more effort on trying to evaluate its policies ex post, so kind of take a retrospective look back at what its policies have achieved, what the costs and what the benefits of those policies are. To date, I think there's frankly sort of not a lot of information on that, and we recognize again that's oftentimes a challenge and is not easily done. But we do think, as going forward, as we have these more aggressive goals, trying to get a better handle on, what the costs of these different policies are, is important to try to kind of minimize those costs. And some ways that the state might want to think about doing that is more planning upfront as regulations and policies are being developed or expanded, thinking about, a few years down the line, how are we going to evaluate what the costs of these programs have been, to kind of inform future decisions in the state, as well as to the extent California is kind of providing a demonstration to the rest of the world on which policies work and how well they work and how cost effective they are. Having that information available would be all the more valuable for kind of showing to other jurisdictions, which policies work and what their effects are. So I will leave my comments there.
Thanks. Phoebe Seaton. I'm with the organization called Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. We're based in the San Joaquin Valley and Coachella Valleys. We work with lower income communities and communities of color in particular on issues that run the gamut. That climate is really fundamental to all of them. It mostly manifests when we're trying to reorganize our webpage, and we're like, do we put climate in land use, or do we put it in transportation, or do we put transportation in climate? And we realize that climate and emissions impacts everything. I think I don't have as much of a technical background in social cost of carbon. Our relationship with social cost of carbon, it's often a kind of a desdemona as why where communities we work with are often asked, do you want environmental protections or do you want economic security? Do you want jobs? Do you want economic security? And same with carbon pricing. Do you want to contribute to reduce carbon emissions, or do you want to be able to afford to live where you live? And our kind of fundamental position is nobody should be put in a position where they're forced to decide whether their economic security is going to be challenged by climate change or by our policies to confront climate change. And we recognize that we can do both. The onus is on us to make sure that lower income communities aren't put in that situation and aren't posed with that question, that impossible question. And I think we've talked a bit today about how climate change and carbon emissions are impacting people and impacting health and impacting the pocketbook, and more so for lower income folks, where the kind of margin of error on what you can afford and what you can't is pretty narrow. I think that one of the issues that we really try to work on is addressing some of the obstacles to making sure lower income communities can participate in addressing social cost of carbon and reduced emissions. And we work on actually a couple of proceedings at CPUC and other places where we're addressing, or we're trying to address some decades and decades, if not more, of land use planning and investment decisions that put lower income communities in a position where they're less likely to be able to adapt and access cleaner energy. So we're working on a proceeding at the CPUC with communities that never had access to natural gas. They've also not had access to resources for housing rehab, and often accessing support for transition to solar or transition to clean energy is difficult. And similarly, on the issue on VMTs, when we look at kind of transitioning from lower carbon fuels, unless we have protections keeping communities from displacement, unless we have policies addressing, we work in a lot of rural communities where we're making sure we have transit options that address not just urban opportunities, but also rural opportunities, then we will continually have this divide and this very true and compelling argument that people least able to kind of support an increase in gas prices are bearing the brunt. So I think we really need to focus not just on the kind of the cost of the pump, the cost at the meter, the cost at the purchase price, but what policies are in place to make sure that all communities, all Californians, and especially the most vulnerable Californians, tenants, rural folks, lower income people, people of color, people with linguistic capacity issues have the access that they need to adapt to kind of the changing portfolio of energy kind of opportunities. I just wanted to, I guess, touch again on it. We also make a lot of decisions in the kind of energy sphere and in all spheres about what taxpayer dollars and ratepayer dollars are paying for. And this comes into, I think this might be most relevant in the rebates and in the cost protection conversation, but it's also become very relevant in the other conversation about who has access and how do we make sure that we're creating access to cleaner energy and lower carbon fuels. I've not been that involved or that engaged in CPUC proceedings, probably about 5 or 6 at this point, but the amount of pushback from the ratepayer advocates on making sure lower income communities and communities of color in the San Joaquin Valley can have access to community solar has been pretty incredible. And it's disheartening to see where we have an appetite to subsidize and where we don't. You know, at the same time, there's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars going into biomethane, for example, which doesn't address the issues around climate change in lower income communities. And so I think we also have to take a stronger look at where we're choosing to put our taxpayer and ratepayer subsidies to support lower income communities as we shift. And then kind of a couple just programs that have been really successful kind of in this frame are mentioned a pilot program out of the CPUC to address communities that have never had access to natural gas. And the vast majority of communities, I think one thing that we've learned in our work is there's no community member who's engaged in the San Joaquin Valley and Coachella Valley who doesn't understand the relationship between climate change and economic and environmental sustainability. So the vast majority of communities that were kind of presented with options as to what energy source they wanted to transition to from propane, vast majority of communities are going to community solar. And that looks like it's a really promising program, not just on getting kind of funding for community solar, but increasing access to community solar for lower income and rural communities. Another on the transit and transportation side is there's still a lot of, I think, attention on urban, where transit is in urban environments, and unless we address the transit gaps in rural communities, we're again gonna constantly have the burden of increased gas prices on lower income rural folks who don't have any other options. So we've been working with a lot of partners on rideshare programs, community-driven rideshare programs with all electric vehicles, which has been just a great program in terms of reduced reliance on gas, increased social cohesion, kind of increased access to services. And then just another pitch for we just can't let environmentally, economically, socially increased costs that might be associated with reduced reliance on carbon to get in the way. We've made policy decisions in the past to subsidize, to do cost protections for lower income folks as we see changes in energy costs and energy prices and energy policies. And it's really important to make sure that we have collectively an appetite to do that so that we can get where we need to be on the climate frame. And that's it.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Deepika Nagabhushan. I'm from the Clean Air Task Force. We're an independent nonprofit environmental organization, about 20 years old. We focus mainly on climate change, and we work towards understanding what technologies we need to solve this problem. We have a global outlook, although majority of our people are here in the US, and we work on developing and analyzing policies that would get these technologies that we know we need to a point where they're able to be adopted at the scale that, and they become a mainstream option. So we work at the federal level, and as well as I'm based here in California, and I try to focus on California. And today my presentation is going to be about affordability. And I'm just going to make 3 main points. I know I've got a lot of slides, but it's actually just three points. And I'm just going to summarize them right at the front, so it sets a framework. So point number one is that we need to ensure that we get to a zero carbon electricity system in an affordable way, because if we fail to do that, it can jeopardize our overall success in achieving carbon neutrality in California, and of course it applies everywhere. Second, zero carbon electricity is not enough. We obviously need more. We need to envision and achieve a zero carbon energy system. That's just not electricity, because electricity is not going to be the only form of energy we will consume. And to do the above, the third point is to do the above, we will need to adopt a whole range of technological options and approaches, and sort of not lock ourselves in with one or one set of technologies that could, impact affordability. So those are the three main points. So let me just get into the first one. That is the zero carbon electricity system is critical to our overall deep decarbonization success. Oh yeah, that's right. So I was working on my laptop. Okay. Electricity is expected to have a big role to play in deep decarbonization. In fact, several modelers kind of expect that by 2050, it's going to form about 50% of our total energy demand. And just for perspective, right now, California uses 23% of its energy in the form of electricity, so that's basically doubling. And so that's why I meant that if we fail to decarbonize this sector, then it is a huge risk. And the reason for why modelers will place such a high, share of the work on electricity is because it's less costly to decarbonize relative to other sectors, and it's a lot easier, relatively speaking. And so here are the factors. I just want to sort of walk through some factors that will impact affordability. The first point is that if we rely solely on variable renewables, which is solar or wind, because they're not always available, plus batteries for storage, we see big challenges, and that can impact affordability. And the reason for that is basically seasonal variability. And the chart on the screen right now shows what that seasonal variability means. This is data that our CATF analyzed, and this is CAISO data. What you see is the dark black line is the load for California, and the dotted line is combined generation currently from both wind and solar resources. What you see is that in some months there is a surplus of energy, that we're producing more than the required electricity, and there are some months that we produce less from those resources than what we need. So those gaps, today we don't have battery technologies that can store all of that energy from like 4 months and then discharge it later in the winter. Right now, the batteries are capable of discharging just 4 hours of energy, so it helps on a daily basis, but not over months. And just to continue that point, even if we were to assume that we cut costs of batteries, and we still want to do this with batteries, just looking at how much that surplus is, that's 35 trillion kilowatt hours, or 35 million megawatt hours. And even if I assumed like 1/5 of the cost of batteries on a kilowatt hour basis, and multiply that by that number, I get $3 trillion. And that is equal to California's GDP, or even more than India's GDP. It just sort of puts into perspective the affordability aspect of like relying on just one set of technologies. It also goes to show that we definitely need to come up with another way of storing electricity if we were to continually rely on variable renewable generation. basically that analysis points to the fact that there is this role for zero carbon firm energy, and zero carbon firm energy is a source of energy that doesn't cycle with sun and wind. It's something that's available all the time. Having zero carbon energy options that are firm will enable us to lower system costs of zero carbon electricity. And as you can see, the first one, I'm sorry for the really, really tiny font. The first set of bars, that it says $57 and $58 per megawatt hour. That are two different scenarios. The dark blue one is is only using variable renewables and batteries, and the light blue is all carbon-free resources along with those technologies. You see that that's what you get when you want to meet 60% of your electricity with those technologies, and you want to get to 60% zero carbon. And you get to like 57, 58, which is already 1.5 times current electricity prices. You go up to 80%, that's the center case. You see that there's a big discrepancy when you start, relying heavily on batteries and variable renewables, and it's almost 6 times what it would cost if you were to include other zero carbon forms of electricity that are not intermittent. I think the point is pretty much made when you look at the large bar on the right-hand side, where it's 100% carbon-free electricity from, renewables versus all carbon-free resources. The distance is it's so much. So it sort of highlights the affordability aspect of adopting multiple kinds of technologies versus relying only on one family of variable renewables. So when you think about zero carbon electricity, we have to think about it more broadly. Another aspect, and I'll run through this really quick, is the same kind of scenarios. 60% are the first 2 bars, and the 80% is the last 2 bars. You see the land size required, the physical footprint required when you rely on wind, solar, and batteries is way more than when you rely on a set of a portfolio of zero carbon technologies. And it's just, again, it's another issue it's a challenge that will hinder our efforts to reach that zero carbon electricity system, which is very important. This is going into my second point, which is that we need more than just zero carbon electricity. We need a zero carbon energy system, and that means that there are things that we can't do with electricity, and I'm just going to highlight what those things are. So, of course, we have, in California, we have seen that electricity sector has reduced its emissions, but other sectors are harder. Yeah, there it is. To mitigate industrial emissions, which forms 24% of the pie that you just saw in the previous slide, we need more than electrification. The bars that you see on the left-hand side, they are steel, cement, and chemicals. I know it's really hard to read. And the gray pieces are emissions that are not from heat generation. It's actually from process emissions. So it's not about energy generation. Those emissions just come from processes itself, like to make steel or to make cement or to make chemicals. So there's nothing electricity can do there. But then there are also other pieces of those bars that are high temperature heat. And for supplying high temperature heat for industrial purposes, currently we don't have the ability to do that with electricity in an economical way. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that the dark blue, that's the portion of high temperature heat that is required in across industrial processes. Again, something that electricity cannot address. So we need more than electrification. In transportation, which is 41% of the whole pie. This is a chart from the from Air Resources Board report. You see that 1/3 of the transportation emissions comes from heavy-duty vehicles, shipping, aviation, and rail, which are really hard to electrify using because of technologies that we have for storage, and those are going to require other solutions that will make it affordable. And so we obviously, as I said, this is my third point, we need to embrace multiple options. and those options include zero carbon liquid fuels, and the zero carbon gaseous fuels for transport, high temperature industrial heat, building heat, and to also generate electricity. So even within electricity, there's going to be a role for zero carbon liquid fuels. We need other renewable sources, potentially geothermal energy and high temperature heat from nuclear energy. We need to also work on addressing those process emissions, those gray bars that I pointed out. We have to figure out how to work to change those processes in such a way that we can reduce emissions, introduce efficiencies. And of course, there's going to be a significant role for carbon capture and storage technologies to play for those emissions, which are process emissions, and you can't really replace that with electricity. This is just a vision of a zero carbon energy system. Again, I know it's really hard to see. It's got zero carbon electricity in the middle, supplied by nuclear energy, wind and solar with batteries, even hydrogen, which is used to generate electricity, and then there's zero carbon electricity going into transport, industry and buildings, as well as hydrogen itself to produce heat and to power transport and to produce heat in industry and buildings. There's advanced geothermal producing zero carbon electricity. There's natural gas, which is a fossil fuel with carbon capture, which then doesn't emit CO2. Which could then create a role for, so it's multiple options. We can't at this point sort of tie one hand behind our back and let one of these options go. We actually need to address the real problem with all of these options on the table to enable an affordable transition to a zero carbon energy system. In conclusion, I just want to say that we need to develop all options. And also I want to add a little bit of a caveat here that it is possible to see technological breakthroughs that we didn't expect or we don't expect right now that can really change the game. But since we can't see the future, it's the risk, we need to reduce the risk by sort of having policies in such a way that will support multiple kinds of zero carbon technologies. And I think that to call back one of the presentations that happened yesterday in the carbon neutrality workshop yesterday, we have to think about how we deliver. We have to just value delivered energy. It doesn't matter where it comes from as long as it's zero carbon, and we need to think about policies in that way. I also just want to point out that there are things I didn't address in this presentation, like super pollutants, methane. I didn't address the land use sector, and I didn't address carbon removal because we do need to go beyond carbon neutrality to negative emissions. I didn't have the time to touch upon these things, but I just want to leave it open and say that I didn't forget about them. They're important as well.
Thank you. I'm going to be quick. I want to just make a couple of points. Obviously, California, we're here today because California does have an affordability issue when it comes to electricity. We have very high electricity rates. For a long time, we consoled ourselves by saying we have relatively low bills, but as the climate changes and as the share of the population moving into the Central Valley and moving into the hotter parts of the state increases, that's not really going to work as a way to console ourselves. And furthermore, with increasing income disparity, we still have quite a few people who are having a hard time affording even the bills they are getting now. Part of that is that energy costs money, but a big part of that in California is that California state policies are leading the way in carbon reduction and energy innovation. We have a lot of low and zero carbon generation. We have energy efficiency programs. We have integration of renewable energy and all the challenges that poses. And we are building increasing amounts of storage, which is still quite an expensive technology. These are good policies. I think they're something the state should be doing. I do want to raise the question of whether we should be paying for them through volumetric electricity prices. That seems to be just the default. And I think it's something that we really need to revisit. California is on the leading edge of these technologies, but that's also the bleeding edge in terms of costs, resulting in very high electricity prices. And now that's getting further complicated because we're facing additional costs from wildfires and climate change. We're having discussions of who's going to bear the cost of the past wildfires and who's going to bear the costs of tree trimming and aggressive changes to the environment around the grid. And regardless of what you think the conclusion or what you think the right solution is, that's going to be expensive as well. There seems again to be a default that once we make sure that the shareholders of the utilities pay for anything for which they are liable, additional costs beyond that, and there definitely will be, will go to ratepayers. I don't think that's an obvious connection. There are lots of disasters that the state steps in and pays for out of the state budget. And I think we need to start thinking harder about which of these costs should go into the electricity sector and which of these costs should be paid for out of the state budget. Paying for things out of the state budget is not free. It costs real money in terms of the payments, and it also costs real money in terms of the economic distortion from raising those tax revenues through other sorts of taxes. So it's not just a free lunch, but I think at this point it's something we really need to examine as we think about how we're going to continue to move forward on addressing climate change, on mitigation, and at the same time deal with the effects that we're seeing from climate change. Two problems that result when we charge high rates. One is an economic efficiency issue, one that I've addressed with Jim Bushnell on a number of papers, that we're charging rates now that are just massively higher than the true cost, marginal cost of supplying electricity. And when we do that, we encourage people to take actions that are privately efficient, that is, they save money, but actually are not saving society money. So if we really are going to have greater electrification, which seems to be a major component of any serious strategy for reducing greenhouse gases, we're not going to do it charging people 20 cents or more per kilowatt hour. The second issue, and the issue we're here to talk about today, is the distributional impacts. If we're going to raise this money to pay for wildfires, to pay for R&D programs and early investments in alternative energy, to pay for energy efficiency, to pay for subsidies through for low-income customers, there's no obvious reason that we should be paying for that through electricity rates. And when we do pay for it through electricity rates, that is almost certainly a more regressive approach than many other approaches that the state has to raising revenues. Now, that's not the only policy factor, but I think it's one we have to take more seriously than we have. Low-income programs do protect the very poorest customers to some extent in California, but there are a lot of middle-income customers who are not protected, and as rates go up, are finding it very difficult, particularly the middle-income customers who are living in the hotter climates of the state. So I want to propose that we take a step back, look at the costs that are embedded in these electricity bills now, look at the costs that are going to get embedded if we continue down this path going forward, including wildfire damages and including increased preventive measures to prevent further wildfire damages, and ask, should these really be paid for through electricity rates, or can we pay for them through the state budget in a way that is less distortionary of electricity rates so that we can give people an incentive to electrify water heating and space heating, and even some of those industrial processes that you just heard about, which definitely are not economic at 20 cents a kilowatt hour, or with outrageous or extremely high demand charges, but could be economic if we got rates down to reflect the true social marginal cost of the energy that they're consuming. And I think if we did it through the general fund, we very likely could find ways that are less regressive to pay for these costs. This is not a slam dunk. This is something that I think needs a lot of careful thought, but it doesn't even seem to be on the table at this point. And as we move forward, we see these rates and we want to move towards greater electrification and lower carbon, I think it's something that we're going to have to confront. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you, everyone. I think there were many themes that sort of were interwoven, electricity pricing being one of them. I have a few questions and issues I wanted to raise. I think we've been talking about affordability in the context of the costs, and Phoebe, you mentioned this, but how do we think about how Californians can deal with and can they afford to live with the impacts of climate change if we do not take action? So it's like the dual side of the coin. And is there a way we can sort of think about the social cost of carbon as an estimate of the damages that our Californians are currently undergoing if by inactivity? And is there a way we can sort of tease that out into an affordability metric? And I don't know if anyone had some sense of that, or I think we've just focused on the costs and the rates, but there also is a cost of inaction, and there are real costs, and there are going to be impacts to low-income communities if we don't actually take action on climate. And maybe how do we start thinking about that in the context of policies in California?
Can I kind of have two thoughts about that. I think first, we already are paying the cost of climate impacts, and wildfire being the sort of easiest, most urgent example, where we now are confronted with paying both climate mitigation costs and climate adaptation costs at the same time. And I think, this fundamental question of how much of that should be ratepayer and how much of that should be broader is a really important question. And so I think part of the challenge, and it kind of gets to what David was talking about, which is when you're looking at all these societal cost tests talk about, the country, or they talk about the world. And here in California, we're just at this so much more granular level where we're not just talking about the state. We're also talking about ratepayers versus taxpayers. We're talking about ratepayers in different regions. Some of the conversation, San Francisco talks about, should we municipalize in San Francisco, which would have a massive impact on people who are not there because the wildfire impacts and costs are much greater in the far reaches of the utility territory than in the urban part of the utility territory. So as you start chunking things up, that really has a big equity impact. So I don't have a good solution, but I think it's a much more complex question than simply identifying what the costs of the damage are.
I think it's really important to be honest with ratepayers and citizens of California that there is no trade-off between our mitigating greenhouse gases and the climate change damages. California needs to mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions because we need to be good global citizens and hope that the rest of the world will also do it. But this idea that if we just get down to some magic number, we won't have climate change damages is just completely wrong, and I think ultimately will backfire. I know it's used to motivate people, but I think it will ultimately backfire because regardless, first of all, the next 30 years is mostly baked in, the scientists tell us. And so during that time, we are going to have to deal with mitigation, and second, or with adaptation. And beyond then. And secondly, California is 1% of world greenhouse gas emissions. When we reduce emissions, the main thing we're contributing is knowledge to how to do this. The cap and trade program, the various technologies we support, the initiatives on renewables and batteries and so forth, is creating knowledge so that places that, particularly the developing world, can adopt the things that work. I'm on the board of governors of the California ISO. The ISO has visitors practically weekly from other states and countries looking at how California manages to balance the grid with extremely high levels of intermittent renewables. That's the sort of knowledge creation California is doing that's changing the world. But as we move to higher level of renewables, I don't think we want to tell the people of California that will avoid this problem that we're seeing in with climate change. The fact is we're really going to have to confront it and pay for it somehow.
So I have a follow-up to that. How would you suggest, or what are the ways that we could value that creation of knowledge? I think that's something that California, at least in the economic modeling, has really struggled with, is how do you put a price tag on that? And that can help motivate then action. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do, and I think the first way we do it is by starting to do it, which we haven't even started to. And I've been sort of beating this drum for years now, and but I think there's a fairly straightforward idea behind it, which is doing scenario analyses. If we're going to talk about carbon sequestration, for instance, if this worked and if it got to price X, how scalable is it? Where are the opportunities to do it? How likely is it to be adopted in places that are the most carbon-intensive economies in the world? I think those are the questions we have to ask. Obviously, solar is great in California. Despite the fact that Germany is quite devoted to it, it's really not a good fit for Germany. And so I think that we need to be realistic about which technologies have a potential path, recognizing the huge uncertainty to each of these technologies, and if they are successful, where they could be used. These are not going to be precise estimates, but they are going to be valuations of which risks are worth taking. And I think that's the sort of thing California is really good at. I mean, we have a knowledge economy. We have been doing this in many sectors and continue to in the state. And so we need to take seriously this process of making these investments and focus on that. And to be honest, focus less on whether we hit a specific greenhouse gas number for what is a subset of California greenhouse gas emissions, because these numbers exclude lots of sources, and focus more on how are we really contributing to the world fight against climate change.
I just want to follow up. I agree. I think that. But another thing that I want to talk about, again, kind of coming back to California and the work that a lot of us are doing, is on the value of peer-to-peer and what the kind of the influential impact that can have. Again, a very small program, but a program called Van y Vienen in rural California was this all-electric rideshare, which seemed completely out of left field for a lot of people who kind of are just struggling to figure out how they're going to get to work. And between social media and peer-to-peer impacts, that program is now in about 20 communities. And so I think that there's a role for kind of academic and kind of the formal or the kind of accepted knowledge economy, and the role of community members. And I think that we could really build that out and have a kind of a global impact on a peer-to-peer side.
Just one remark. So I agree with everything that Severin said, and I just want to highlight one aspect there. I think it's not only that we show that certain technologies can work, but I think it's also that we can. So if California can show that you can implement stringent emission mitigations in an equitable and affordable way, sort of policy design experiments, then you can that would be another hope, right? That you can export actually policy designs, not just technologies. And I think it will have to be the wealthy parts of the world that experiment with different designs and demonstrate that you can achieve that, because it's sort of a hard sell to go to a poor country and say, okay, you try this out. That they're struggling already enough. So I think that is really one thing where California can do a lot of good. And I mean, Germany's trying a similar thing, to just try out different policies and then evaluate them and show the world that some of them might work.
If I can just follow up on something Ross said, that California, I think, is also, while we are leading on lots of experiments and technologies, we are not doing a good job of after-the-fact evaluation. And we need to get much more serious and much less political about being willing to step up and say, this is working at this cost, or this is not working, and being willing to be completely upfront about that, because that's how you create knowledge, not by just plowing ahead and saying, oh, this is all great. It's not all great. If every experiment works, you're not running enough experiments.
I like that. And I would agree in terms of the policy design. There's this one chart that everyone loves, international visitors in different jurisdictions, and it's the California GDP going up and GHG emissions going down. And it really does, that I think really encapsulates what we need to do is in terms of sort of pushing the envelope elsewhere, is that's a really compelling story that you can grow an economy in a low carbon way, and it can continue to grow. I did have a question. We've been really focused on carbon. How do we think about affordability and in the carbon world, and think about co-benefits and think about very localized impacts, both in terms of air pollution and other benefits related to employment? And are there ways and different metrics or different things that people think would be helpful in not just focusing on the objective of carbon, but also having sort of this multi-pronged approach, which California needs to have, because we do still have air quality issues in parts of the state, and we do want to have a continuing vibrant economy.
I have views on this too, but I also sit on the advisory council to the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and we have been involved in many discussions of greenhouse gas limits on refineries, of local pollution in disadvantaged communities, and so forth. I understand the appeal of co-benefits, and I think that it's something we should be thinking hard about, but I also worry that when we tell particularly disadvantaged communities, this greenhouse gas program is going to solve your problem, what we get is what we have gotten in the last couple of years, is disadvantaged communities saying, wait, greenhouse gases programs aren't solving our problem, and a lot of anger. And that's because those programs weren't designed to solve that problem. I have learned a lot more in the last 3 years on the advisory council about the power that the local air districts have, which is essentially only over stationary sources, the power that the ARB has, and the apparent huge gaps between those to address things like below the standard pollution from both stationary and mobile sources. Essentially, we set these standards, and then we give away for free pollution up to those standards. And the standards are not close to zero, and we essentially give the companies no incentive to reduce their pollution further. And I think that's just not going to get us where we need to go. If we started charging for pollution even up to the standards, which the local air districts apparently don't have the legal authority to do, we would see refineries and industrial processes and many other sources addressing those in a much more serious way. But what they see instead is, it's free up to the standard, let's hit the standard, and then we're done and can go home. And I don't think that's a recipe for innovation.
This isn't like a cost angle, but just I guess an approach. So I mentioned zero carbon fuels in my presentation. One of the, for instance, if you were to produce ammonia, use carbon capture, take out the carbon from ammonia manufacture, and use ammonia in certain uses like mobile sources like diesel, where diesel engines replace ammonia where diesel is previously used, that could have air quality benefits. And again, I don't know how closely removing carbon and getting air quality benefits can be linked, but this is just one of the strategies. And I think zero carbon fuels, both hydrogen and ammonia, could have those benefits in certain situations. So I think that it would be important to think about creating a system that will enable these fuels to be used and address those emissions.
I don't think I disagree with Severin, but that the issue on the greenhouse gas and the air pollution is inextricably linked, in part from a policy perspective. I think, unfortunately, because there was an ascendancy and interest in greenhouse gas emissions, there was a less interest in air quality, and that's hopefully changing. The unfortunate reality is that we weren't able to move a strong air quality agenda without linking it to the strongest air quality agenda we've put forth, which isn't strong enough, is AB 617, and that was because it was tied to greenhouse gases, and it was it was sort of a package deal. It was a consolation prize, and that you can't. But there's also a physical link, and where there are greenhouse gas emissions, there is air pollution, and that we do need to have a framework where we're addressing both. I think some of the gaps that we're seeing on the not just stationary sources, but on the mobile sources, again, where you have greenhouse gas emissions, you also have these huge pollution impacts. Another huge gap, and I don't know if this is as true in Bay Area, is on the area-wide pollutants. Again, the area-wide pollutants from ag and other sources are not just air quality, they're also GHG. So where we have these enormous gaps in our GHG emission portfolio and programs, we also have huge gaps in air pollution. So I would argue that they are linked and kind of should be seen that way.
So I just want to one quick remark on that. I think it's really important to take local air pollution into account. And if you think back to the federal Clean Power Plan rule and the cost-benefit analysis that originally accompanied that, then the benefits from so they separately quantified the climate benefits and the local air pollution benefits. And I think the local air pollution benefits actually were larger than the climate benefits. And either one of them would have been by itself larger than the cost of the regulation. So just to give you sort of a sense of order of magnitudes, right? Local air pollution benefits are an important part, and you should, they're not an addendum to the climate benefits.
Just want to add, I agree that it's definitely important to be thinking about local air pollutants and the effects of policies on local air pollutants. It's clearly, in a lot of cases, an important benefit associated with the policies. I am also a little bit nervous about sort of, trying to do both at the same time or with the same policies. And so I do think it's a good idea to try to address each separately to the extent feasible. But I often also recognize sometimes that might be difficult to do. I do want to flag kind of one area where there is clearly kind of a link between the two policy areas now, and AB 617 was mentioned. A chunk of cap and trade revenue is used to kind of fund engine replacements or just local pollution reduction activities through that fund, and so some of our climate policies are kind of directly targeted at reducing local air pollution through that funding source. And just to kind of tie it back to the affordability question, I think in a world if carbon prices get higher and there are greater concerns around sort of the affordability of cap and trade or some of our climate policies, and the state starts thinking about well, can the revenue from cap and trade be used to kind of address some of those affordability issues, that will could potentially kind of create a tension between, funding for local air pollutant, kind of where the priorities are on kind of, addressing sort of that environmental concern with local air pollutants and the sort of more financial affordability issue. So just wanted to flag sort of a potential relationship between those.
I think that's a very important point. One thing I think that was mentioned briefly is adaptation. And I think if we're thinking about carbon neutrality and affordability, how do we sort of divide up the pie and think about the role of the cost that we're going to be paying for mitigation, the cost of potential adaptation, and then the cost of more climate ambition? Are there ways that you think we should be sort of dividing those up to sort of understand the trade-offs in terms of some of that, and maybe that can help focus some of our climate ambition?
I think the problem with your question, though, is I don't know that we have the luxury of doing that, because like I was saying before, just looking at the cost that we have to look at, we have to make sure we are moving forward with our emissions goals. We have to keep air quality in mind, and we have to deal with sea level rise. We have to deal with wildfire. We have to deal with how subsidence affects the gas distribution system. We have to deal with all of those things. And so that's why it becomes really important to understand what the financial impact on individual customers, both residential, commercial, industrial, understand what that impact is, and then understand that at a granular level, we are going to have to make some trade-offs. In California, when I talk to commissioners from other states who are trying to reduce their emissions, in the electricity sector, I am reminded of how incredibly fortunate we are in California to have so much low-hanging fruit, right? We have great hydro. We have, for now, we have nuclear, although that will be going away. We have great opportunities for both distributed solar and utility-scale solar. When I talk to commissioners in Hawaii who have the same 100% goal that we have, their land costs and their ability to deploy solar on a larger scale is pretty difficult. And so, we have been lucky to be able to have that low-hanging fruit. And now that we've already plucked that low-hanging fruit, then I think our cost analyses, at least for the electric sector, are going to be, okay, what can we do that will be that will not drive up electricity costs so much that it will dampen the enthusiasm for electrification of transportation and appliances, and how can we find technologies that are affordable or that have a cost curve that's going down, and how can we encourage those to develop, and how can we take advantage of those? So we're trying to figure out how we can do all those things all at the same time, and it's pretty difficult.
Can I just add that Leanne's list was quite extensive, and I agree with it. What troubles me is when a CPUC commissioner considers it their cost problem entirely to solve, and I think that's something we need to change, that the legislature and the state government have to take on some of these costs. And not just nascent technology, renewable investment, but I think we have to recognize that the tree trimming that we used to do 40 years ago still allowed fires to start, but they were small fires. And it happened and we moved on. What's changed is that those are now massive wildfires. I think that one can easily make the argument that is a state safety issue and one that should be addressed in the state budget. I think we need to examine whether, how much that would cost in the state budget and what the distortions from that would be. But we at least need to have that on the table as an alternative and not say that all of this sits at the CPUC and has to be paid for through rates.
Just one sort of piece of information. If you use the social cost of carbon, it includes adaptation cost estimates. So that's part of the damage that these models estimate. So if that extra ton of CO2 turns up the heat and you run your air conditioning more, then that's a way of adapting, and the extra cost of running that air conditioning is accounted for in the social cost of carbon. So that's, I think, all I just wanted to say.
I had one last question, and this is on, we've talked about how expensive everything, all the balls in the air that you have to keep going. What is the role of advanced technology, and sort of how do we think about looking towards alternatives if it is that everything is getting, that there's a lot that needs to be done, both on mitigation and thinking about climate ambition and cost. How do you see the role of advanced technology? And I'd love to hear from Phoebe specifically if you have thoughts on sort of just, what's the appetite for investments in direct air capture, CCS, things that might present different lower cost pathways in the future, and is there appetite for that? Maybe from the EJ perspective.
Yeah, I would love to punt a little bit to Deepika, but I think there's a strong appetite for investment in R&D. I think the big caveat, or not, I wouldn't say it's a caveat, but the strong interest is in developing improved technologies that are responsive to both the GHG issues, but also other climate issues, water quality and air quality. And so there is some concern about emerging technologies that focus entirely on the GHG side to the detriment of other environmental factors. So I think there is a lot of interest in kind of the investment. There's also a lot of interest in, just from an economic development standpoint, which is an area we're just beginning to dabble in, is ensuring access to R&D. So there's kind of more kind of STEM and who can participate in this new kind of emerging technologies and emerging economy. And so yes, but kind of with those conditions.
I think that the government has a role to play in policy design. And I think that sort of developing policies that are performance-based rather than picking specific technologies or picking winners can be one way of encouraging innovation. And of course, R&D from a state budget perspective is important. And I think just on the carbon capture specifically, because I work closely on that technology, I can just say one line about it. When carbon capture technology needs to be applied on a stationary source that has CO2 emissions, typically those emissions also contain other pollutants. And for certain kinds of carbon capture technologies to actually work efficiently, you have to remove those pollutants. So it isn't a matter of that technology removing pollutants, but if you want to use carbon capture, there will have to be investments made on other technologies that will remove those air pollutants. So there is that co-benefit. I don't know if I want to call it co-benefit, but it's related. If there are incentives that can be thought up in such a way that will encourage both of those steps and doesn't discourage the investment in CCS just because there's going to be additional costs to remove those impurities. So thinking about policy design that can encourage such actions, I think can address both the needs. And that's the key point I wanted to make. Oh, sorry, one more thing. I think it's important also to leverage federal policy and sort of see the private sector reacting to a combination of policies that exist. So for instance, for carbon capture specifically, there is a federal tax credit right now, and it has a commenced construction window which ends in January 2024. So if the private sector in California needs to act, there is an opportunity for California to leverage the opportunities that are created outside of California as well.
Great, thank you. I think now we'll open it up to public questions. So if anyone has a question, raise your hand, and we've got some roving microphones.
Hi, David Dunn, Idemitsu Apollo. Just more of a statement and a point of clarification. Ross, I think you mentioned the LCFS price per ton versus the cap and trade price per ton, $17.5 versus $196. I think one of the important things to point out is what those are doing. LCFS is wheels to well. So in effect, you've got three covered entities, so to speak, under cap and trade. You've got the extraction, you've got refining, and then you've got tailpipe. So it's really like 52.5 to 196. Second, if you look on a price per gallon, the tailpipe alone under cap and trade is about 16 cents per, or sorry, it's about 14 cents per gallon under cap and trade, and it's about 16 cents in LCFS. So LCFS covering wheels to wells, even at 196, is 16 cents. Just covering the tailpipe portion under cap and trade is 14 cents. So in effect, cap and trade is way more expensive on a price per gallon than LCFS is today. The other thing I'd point out is that it's kind of telling you how expensive it is to cut the transportation sector. Emily alluded to the graph of GDP up, emissions down, but you look at the transportation sector emissions and they're flat to higher over that time frame. So I just want to be careful at how we look at those and don't use the shock and awe headline numbers, because LCFS is one of the most complicated things I've ever seen written. And very few people, I think, can really understand it, especially with a quick first glance. And it's measuring a specific CI reduction, not necessarily, it wasn't really designed to price a specific metric ton. That's sort of a byproduct of the way it's traded, because you're trying to establish a specific exact CI reduction in a sector that is notoriously expensive to do so.
If I can comment, I agree on the last point that we are trying to target a specific technology that's very tough. The wells to wheels thing, I think, doesn't change the calculation. The vast majority of the emissions are the tailpipe and the refinery, both of which are covered under cap and trade. The upstream it depends on the numbers you use, but 15 or less %. So I'm not sure where you're getting $50 to be equivalent, but the fact is, I think it's telling us it's really expensive to take carbon out of fuels. And that may not ultimately be the way to do it. I certainly was in discussions 15 years ago when there were companies that were telling me, we're almost there, we're going to have second generation biofuels that are cost competitive and so forth. And there has been tremendous progress on the diesel side. But the fact is, replacing gasoline is really tough. And I think that is telling us that. I don't think we should take this price comparison as saying we should give up on trying to change fuels. But I think we should recognize that that may not be the cost-effective way to reduce transportation emissions. That's not where the emissions actually are. The fact. Yes. Something like that. I think it's a little higher than that. Then when refineries are also covered under cap and trade. So the only thing not covered under cap and trade that LCFS covers is the extraction part. That's right. That's right. Yeah. No. That's right.
So I appreciate the comment, David, and I won't kind of go into kind of all the details. I think maybe we can kind of continue the conversation offline on sort of the numbers themselves. I think you do make definitely a valid point on just sort of the kind of transportation sector and it being sort of and particularly fuels being sort of a costly sector to decarbonize. I think another thing to kind of keep in mind when comparing the two policies and the costs associated with the policies are, they're set at sort of different stringency levels, sort of relative to baseline emissions. So part of what's showing up in some of those prices, I think, is just sort of, how stringent the goals are for kind of the particular metric that's trying to be achieved in those policies, and what price is necessary to kind of encourage the actions needed to meet those goals. So it's not all sort of a difference in policy design necessarily, but just kind of how stringent the goals are, at least as they're kind of perceived by the market. So.
Hi there, this is Caitlin Rodner-Sutter, Environmental Defense Fund. Severin, I think I heard you mention that you thought there would be a better way to evaluate climate progress instead of just an annual target. And I'm curious what you think that might be, and you or others have any ideas if there's a way to also incorporate our air quality progress into some sort of measure like that?
I don't have a sketch written out. What I said, I think, is as much as I can sketch out, which is that there are ways to value the potential gains from specific knowledge improvement, whether it's being able to integrate 50 or 60% intermittent renewables, or being able to electrify transportation or improve battery technology. But I think we need to be thinking about, if this works, obviously what's the probability of it working, but if it works, is it something that's scalable to the developing world? On your second question, I really resist, and I know Phoebe comes at this from a different direction than I do, and I am very sympathetic to the view that the EJ community has gotten stiffed for years on local pollution. But I really resist the idea of telling the EJ community we're going to solve this by combining it with greenhouse gases, because there are a lot of solutions for greenhouse gases that do not solve the local pollution problem. And there are a lot of solutions to the local pollution problem, one of which was pushed very hard to the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which was capping refinery GHG emissions. What that would have done almost certainly is just reduce throughput at those refineries that would have indeed reduced local pollution and would have done nothing for greenhouse gas emissions, because we would, and the data are clear on this, would have just imported more. So I think we need to get much more serious and solve these sort of loopholes in local pollution, both pricing it and dealing with it. And I think I've come to believe that it's a bit of a cop-out. Cop-out's too strong a word. It is, I think, wishful thinking to say we're going to solve that by sort of rolling it into climate change. Not to disagree with co-benefits. There are co-benefits. But I think we need to say we're going to solve the local pollution problem. The thing we have learned in the last 20 years about local pollution, particularly particulates, is that they are just way more harmful than people thought 20 years ago. And we just policy has not caught up with that. And it's time for policy to go at that directly, I would say.
Can I just I don't disagree with what Severin's saying, but I also want to give you an example where in the electric sector, at least, we are kind of doing that, which is in the integrated resources plan. Plans that the load-serving entities are required to submit to us. They are supposed to identify both their emissions and their local air impacts. And in the first round of plans that were submitted to us by the 43 load-serving entities in the state that are in our jurisdiction, some of the plans showed that they were meeting progressing toward the GHG emission targets, but they were showing more air pollutants to the extent they didn't submit it in as much detail as we wanted, but they were showing more pollutants because they were relying heavily on solar. And when you rely heavily on solar, you're doing more ramping in the evening, and you're upping your natural gas usage and your cycling, which has air impacts. So, which just highlights the challenge of having enough resources that can handle the ramp that are not emitting resources, either from a GHG perspective or a local air pollutants. So having more opportunities for things like geothermal and other resources is important. But that's an area where we were kind of trying somewhat successfully, not 100% successfully, where we were trying to look at both.
Thanks. Can I follow up real quick? I think, just to be clear, I don't think that, I wasn't suggesting that we're mingling the policy, but maybe doing exactly what you were describing and sort of making sure that we're measuring both and reporting and sharing data on both.
If I could just kind of double down on what Caitlin said, I think that I probably should have more strongly prefaced that I don't think that I was necessarily disagreeing with you. I think that there's sort of both that and for the real reason that there are going to be some programs and policies that address air pollution that don't have anything to do with GHG and shouldn't be ignored and are really important, but to divorce them and pretend that the GHG emission factors have nothing to do with air pollution is a mistake and damaging, and I think it's really important to look at them together. I think that said, to answer your initial question, I really think we should be measuring our GHG progress, and I do think we should be measuring our GHG progress separate from our pollution reduction and being really rigorous in that in both of those.
Michael Carwish-Shell. I'm going to helicopter up more to the topic of neutrality. Lots of really provocative presentations today that followed up very good presentations yesterday. Deepika, you followed Dr. Lewis's presentation extremely well around the incredible cost of storage of electricity for that last electron. You theoretically only need that storage once in its lifetime, and you stepped out and quantified that as potentially $3 trillion just for California. Have you taken any attempt to draw what that asymptotic curve looks like? Because maybe 95% or 90% actually is orders of magnitude less expensive and informs some thinking around, well, how far do you take storage as part of a holistic solution around this challenge of neutrality and where to achieve neutrality?
First, the modeling wasn't something that I did myself, but I'm inviting you to connect with me after so we can set up a call with the person that actually did the modeling. But to your question of, can you clarify what 95% you're referring to?
So your $3 trillion, I understood it to be the storage that would be required to deal with all seasonal variation in electricity supply.
Yeah.
Such that
today.
Yeah. So if it's that expensive, if you say, I'll go to 95% availability of storage and deal with the other 5% in a different way, that cost will be quite a lot less. If you go to 90, it'll be quite a lot less than that. So there's a curve there that might inform a good decision point.
I think that I had a slide on that which said that if you were to do 60% carbon-free with renewables or with a portfolio of carbon-free resources, you'd have it's on $1 per megawatt hour, you'd be at 60, which is pretty much double of where we are today in electricity prices. If you went up to 80% carbon-free with just renewables and batteries, you'd be 6x of what it would cost you to do that with a portfolio. So I know it isn't answering your 95%, but it's just an illustration of if you just went from 60% carbon-free to 80% carbon-free, you're sort of seeing a big jump in costs that you'd incur. I mean, I think the answer to your question would be that it's going to be really hard to do to reach beyond 60%. It's going to be expensive unless we see some technological breakthroughs. And as I said, in the calculation of the $3 trillion, I assumed less than 1/5 of the cost actually that DOE estimates on $1 per kilowatt hour. I didn't even calculate additional electricity because we're going to electrify. We're going to have more electricity. So the denominator is not even changing. I haven't done those scenarios, so it's something that I would love to invite you to have conversations with me separately. But the closest answer that I have right now is that chart that I showed, which was like 6x of when you use a portfolio of technologies.
There is some work going on at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. Amol Phadke is, I think, leading it and doing exactly the thought process that you're suggesting, and it shows exactly what you're suggesting, which is squeezing the last 10% out of the electricity sector is going to be extremely expensive with current technology. We do have to be careful. We're talking about 100% 25 years from now, and if you look back 25 years in technology, there's going to be a lot of technological progress between now and then. Furthermore, there are many other ways we can smooth that with demand response, with trade across the Western grid, with various different sorts of storage and so forth. So I don't think that we should throw out a $3 trillion number as this is what it's going to cost. This is what doing something very limited with current technology would cost. But there are a lot of options out there. And it may turn out that we should, in electricity sector, we shouldn't be religious about 100%. We should get to 95% or 90% and then focus on these other areas where there's going to be much bigger gains from that focus.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. The theme of flexibility, innovation, and optionality, I think, plays into what you just said very well. And even to the point of, well, biomethane does nothing in the valley. Well, perhaps it preserves jobs that create biomethane today. Perhaps that biomethane is a way to deal with the last few percent of electricity. And if you carbon capture sequester that, you might even be negative emissions. So I think keeping our options open and being open to solutions that may not be in our normal space is important as we work together to achieve neutrality in the state.
Is that me? Okay. McKinley, excuse me. McKinley added with ATRA. I'd like to thank the Air Resources Board for convening these two workshops over the last 2 days. They provide a lot of information that we sometimes use to inform some of the business model innovation that needs to happen to realize some of the policy outcomes that the state is promoting. Deepika, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. The analysis that you shared sort of mirrors some of the work that we've done, particularly with respect to land use power density for different generation resources. And when we talk about electrification, I'd like to point out that there are sort of two types of pathways. There's the grid electric utility-based transmitted electricity pathway, and of course then there is the on-site generation pathway that embody a different set of value proposition for the end user. And I also like to instill some hope in the work that you folks are doing by citing an example about the possibility of carbon neutrality that connects at least three of the sectors that have been talked about here today, electricity, transportation, and ag sector. Our company is on track to do a project that delivers zero carbon, high efficiency electricity and thermal energy for a food processor up here in California. And the project is structured so that the electricity rate that the customer pays over a 20-year period is 12 cents a kilowatt hour. This is a customer that today has an electric bill of about $2 million a year. And our technology solution is going to cut that in half over the period of the operation of the system. The transportation piece allows that food processor to deliver their goods to California markets using near zero emission natural gas trucks. And we are able to deliver zero carbon electricity by blending renewable natural gas with fossil natural gas with the generation on site. And all of this ties to the employment aspect, as you folks talked about earlier, because with the rise in the minimum wage requirements for California employers, that particular customer was facing some pressure on their margins. But because we're able to reduce the electricity cost by half, they're able to avoid laying off some of the staff that they might have otherwise had to do in the face of rising electricity prices. Last comment, and then I'll give up the mic, was with respect to the wildfire emissions that are happening, the wildfires that are happening in California. And I think when the carbon emissions from those wildfires that could be attributed to the electric utility system are expressed in the carbon intensity of electricity pathways in California, then some of the cost impacts, I think that Mr. Borenstein talked about, could also be reflected and have a burden, additional burden on the ratepayers. So thank you again for your presentations, and that's what I want to share.
Hi, thank you very much for the insightful discussion. This is Brad Neff with Chevron, and I've just got two questions. First of all, I appreciate David starting off with a description of what social cost of carbon means. And even though there's only 4 people working on it, it seems we have a better handle on that than carbon neutrality. And so I'm curious what the definition of carbon neutrality is at CARB, and if there is none, which I can also understand, how we work to get there. Because in order to solve that, I think we need to have a good definition of what carbon neutrality means. And then second, on affordability, I appreciate a better understanding of how CPUC defines affordability. But there again, it's squishy and it's relative. And so as we admit that these carbon policies are raising prices to customers in California, I'd like to hear your thoughts about what the role of the regulator is in helping business justify those higher costs to their customers because of these programs.
So I can say the carbon neutrality, I mean, that's what these workshops are about. It's about trying to figure out how to define that in the California context and what that should look like. So it's a work in progress, and all of the information that's being collected throughout all of these workshops is going to help inform the definition and the process of how we get there to carbon neutrality in a longer term time frame. So nothing's been set in stone, and this is all part of the discussion to figure out how we should be defining it in California.
And I'll just briefly mention that the affordability framework we're working on right now is focusing on residential customers first, and then it's going to be focusing on commercial and industrial customers. So from the framework of defining what affordability means and delving into that, we haven't reached the other sectors just yet.
But does CARB or the CPUC have a responsibility to put forth and share these numbers that we're talking about here in this small group, the cost per gallon, the cost per megawatt hour, so that businesses here that are under pressure to compete with other companies to serve the needs of our customers and Californians, that they understand where these costs are coming from and why they're paying more here than they would be elsewhere?
I mean, I guess I'll just say, you know, we at the PUC are in kind of a unique position in that we are actually like, you know, you can identify the cost because we're saying, okay, here's the rate case, here's the cost, here are the numbers. And, you know, we have various programs like industrial energy efficiency programs and various rate mitigation efforts. So, you know, we do consider the impact on commercial, industrial, and residential customers and try to look at those impacts. But at the end of the day, you know, we are balancing all these issues and imposing the costs, and then the customers of the utility and the utility are going to have to figure out how they want to message that.
And I would also point out that, leading up to the next scoping plan, which will be a very transparent and public process, this will be part, looking at the metrics, looking at the economic impacts, looking at affordability issues, that will all be discussed thoroughly in the next scoping plan. So once, this is early days in terms of trying to get information together about carbon neutrality, but this is the start of a very public process. And we do have requirements. AB 197 requires us to look at the cost per ton of any different proposed policies as we look towards additional GHG reductions and targets. And we also have statutory requirements in the state whenever we promulgate regulations to do a really deep dive on the economic impacts. And all of that is, of course, part of a very transparent and public process. So there will be information released, and we will convey to Californians and California businesses what those impacts are. I think then the businesses can take it from there.
Kai, Lord Farmer from Ascent Environmental. I appreciate the comments on taking a deeper dive and looking retrospectively at climate change policy and how it's being implemented and costs associated with that and how it's working. So I'm curious about what you think that would look like in reality, looking retrospectively at that, specifically how to do it in a way that wouldn't create political fodder for not doing anything at all, and the potential for including other metrics like social metrics or health metrics in the success of those policies.
So I think, some of the, I don't know that I have a good answer to the question around sort of the political sort of aspects of sort of how the information would then be used. But I do think from sort of a purely kind of process-wise and public policy perspective, some of the things that we think are worth considering and looking at and trying to kind of make sure we just have better information about this is, like I mentioned before, I think trying to think earlier on about setting up a process for evaluating some of these policies, either as they're getting off the ground or they're being amended, bringing in all of the very smart people we have at universities who are very good at trying to sort of tease out the effects of a particular policy. I do want to be cognizant of the fact that there's a lot of different policies in this area, many of which are kind of touching the same sources of emissions, and trying to kind of tease out the effect of a particular policy is difficult. But that's why I think kind of starting with sort of a conversation up front about how we want to do that might help either the design of the policy or some sort of data collection, or maybe in some cases there are opportunities to kind of pilot certain things to kind of try to get a little bit better information later on. So I'm not sure that kind of answers your question around kind of how the information is then interpreted, but I do also kind of want to just reiterate, not just from sort of a California public policy perspective of knowing what our programs are doing and what their effects are. That's important in and of itself. But again, California in this context of being a demonstration to other jurisdictions, having that information to show to other jurisdictions is incredibly important, I think.
I just wanted to add to Russ that Russ pretty much covered it entirely. I just want to say, bringing in researchers at the front end to advise on how you set up a program so that you can, after the fact, do a good evaluation of how much effect it has had, I think is absolutely critical. Once the program has already started, you can sometimes scrap together a way of doing it, but it's a lot more difficult than if you're in on the front end. The politics of this is tough because a lot of these programs are going to fail. And if you run experiments, that's what happens. And I think that we need to get a stiffer spine about that and recognize that we really are trying a lot of things. Some of them aren't going to work. We should adjust and eventually maybe even abandon if something's not working. What we shouldn't do is just keep saying, well, we don't want to know whether it's working, and we're just going to keep plowing ahead. And in many cases, that is what we've done.
And I would add on to that, I think we don't want to have the fear that people will use the information to justify doing nothing. That shouldn't drive whether or not we kind of analyze and pick apart these things. And as I was mentioning earlier, when I talk to other commissioners in other states, I feel really fortunate that in California, we have moved way past the conversation about whether we should do anything. And I have colleagues in other states desperately trying to get their policymakers to agree to want to do something. We don't have that problem. So now we should take advantage of the fact that we don't have that problem to really understand what's the most effective way to do what we need to do, and not be afraid to do what Severin's talking about, and really try to understand what's successful and what's not successful.
Chris, you've got the mic. You can be the last question. Last question.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. Chris Bush with Energy Innovation. Thanks for the presentations and the workshop today. These are comments. If I remember, I'll get to a question at the end. I want to agree with Professor Borenstein on the wildfire costs and some decoupling with rates, and also with various speakers on the need for continued work and innovation on analytics, both backwards or retrospective and forward-looking, and I would say that both CARB and the LAO deserve a lot more resources and support to make that happen, so we can have sort of an Apollo project on evaluation. On the larger question, I think there's been some implication that there's clearly net negative costs for the state in terms of the overall climate effort, and I'd assert that that's unproven. And I would point out in the electricity sector, I think there's some, even though there was an implication that renewables are entirely to blame for whatever rate divergences we see, there's a need to better disentangle the overcapacity of natural gas. A couple other related points on, I would say current analytical methods are biased towards counting costs. And so an example of an uncounted benefit would be in the manufacturing sector. I was going to do a little poll on who knows which product is a top 10 export for California in the clean tech realm, but it seemed a little hokey. But people are always surprised that in 2017, electric vehicles were California's 6th largest export at $3 billion. Again, in 2018, it'll be bigger in 2019 because of the end of federal incentives. Tesla was forcing all of their product, which was massive last year, into the U.S. market. So we'll see electric vehicles grow to a larger amount in 2019, in my opinion. And one other bit on the heat for industry, there needs to be a recognition of the large amount of steam used for oil and gas extraction and the opportunity to use solar thermal concentrating, well-established technology to access that, and recognition that current price incentives under CARB zone forecasting appear to be underperforming in terms of inducing those cost-effective investments based on what I've been running the numbers on, and some of their own statements from companies such as GlassPoint and SolarLight. No conflicts of interest here. Thanks. The question on the $3 trillion from the scenario where you're only, and I would differ with Severin that the $3 billion cost is only current technology, is current technology. It's one slice of current technology. So is that a U.S. number or is that a California number? Because I believe I heard it referred to as a U.S. number.
It was a CAISO number. And in terms of current technology, I just want to point out that I used less than 1/5 of the cost of current technology. So it is assuming something happens in the future or today. And also it wasn't 4-hour battery storage. It was assumed to be 8-hour battery storage, which also doesn't exist today. And it was only using current electricity use as a denominator, not assuming electrification and increase. So it was a very, very conservative estimate. And it does assume some changes in technology.
Okay, but it doesn't include like demand response or regionalization and more access to low-cost wind from Wyoming and those sorts of things?
I don't think so, but I'm not the expert on that study, but I don't think so.
Thank you.
Can I just say, I didn't hear anybody say that renewables are the cost of increases in energy rates. And I think it's really important to be clear that, some renewables are really cheap and some renewables are really expensive. And so you can't just say all renewables are this. I mean, it's much more nuanced.
Fair enough,
than that.
but and Severin can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Jim Bushnell has more or less attributed the price change to renewables. Is that fair or not?
I think you should ask Jim Bushnell, but I'll point out Jim is not on this panel, and so the suggestion that you heard somebody say that renewables are the sole cost of high electricity rates would not be an accurate portrayal of what I said. We certainly have made investments in what are now very expensive renewables. The cost has come down tremendously, and we still have to pay for those. I think trying to pretend that didn't happen is missing the point. We should be doing that sort of stuff. I just say I would argue that that is not an electricity provision expense. That is a California state renewables policy expense, and therefore it doesn't really make sense to say electricity ratepayers should pay for that. And let me just add one more thing on wildfires. When we start talking about wildfires, we're talking about utility-specific costs. So, for instance, the PG&E liability will be paid for by PG&E ratepayers, which is pretty arbitrary when you think about it, because there are these little holes carved out of Alameda and Palo Alto and Redding and the municipals and so forth that don't pay for that, purely out of historical accident. And so I think that recognizing this is a state policy, we have a state-level climate change problem, and thinking about it in a more holistic way is a good way to start.
Forgive me, one more retort that I'm happy to say there's been costs, and I don't want to be accused of being in a fantasy world. So what I said was it's unproven regarding the net costs.
All right, last one. This is really the last question.
Okay, thank you. I'm Allison Smith with SoCalGas, and I had a question about how you value sort of near-term reductions that we can achieve versus longer-term reductions in sort of two instances. One example, we support low NOx trucks, heavy-duty trucks with RNG, and we can achieve immediate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and in NOx emissions, so pollutants, air pollutants. And so we think that there should be an emphasis on getting those near-term reductions. And I'm curious how the social cost of carbon sort of factors into that near-term versus long-term. That's one example, but I'm also curious, yesterday there was a lot of discussion on impact of technology advancement on natural and working lands, and a trade-off on sort of what's the footprint and the carbon impact on natural lands with some of these technology advancements. And I'm curious how the social cost of carbon considers those longer-term impacts as well.
All right, I think this is for me. I painted a slightly simplified version of the social cost of carbon. There's actually a social cost of carbon for every single emission year. So we have a different number for an additional emission today versus an additional emission in 2020 and in 2030 and so on. And we can compute the whole time series of those emissions. So from an economic accounting framework, you would simply take an emission, pick the correct social cost of carbon for that year when it is happening, and then multiplying that, and that gives you the trade-off between emitting earlier versus later. There's an interesting twist to that in how you discount. The way that the federal EPA presented social cost of carbon estimates was that they discounted things back to the year of the marginal emission. So the harms for the social cost of carbon for an emission in the year 2030 were discounted to the year 2030, but they were not discounted to the present year. So what that means is that you take your change in emission in 2030, multiply it with the official SCC number, and then you have to again discount it back from 2030 to the present. The SCC in these net current terms, what EPA did, is increasing over time. But if you actually compute the SCC and discount everything to the present year, I think for everything that I've seen, it is actually falling over time. So that suggests that actually emission reductions earlier on are more valuable than emission reductions later on. And I think there was a second question, but I now forgot what it was.
Well, it was in relation to the issue that was brought up yesterday on impacts of technologies today may have profound impacts later on natural and working lands.
And I think that might be outside the scope, and we are 10 minutes over. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'd like to thank all the presenters. Thank you so much for coming. And there is a third workshop in this week of workshops this afternoon, starting at 1, and Jim Bushnell will be at that one. So if you want to come back at 1, the party will start then. Thank you.